Chapter 1 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, in Marquette, Michigan, December 2007. Deephaven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Preface. This book is not wholly new, several of the chapters having already been published in the Atlantic Monthly. It has so often been asked if Deephaven may not be found on the map of New England under another name, that, to prevent any misunderstanding, I wish to say, while there is a likeness to be traced, few of the sketches are drawn from that town itself, and the characters will in almost every case be looked for there in vain. I dedicate this story of out-of-door life and country people first to my father and mother, my two best friends, and also to all my other friends whose names I say to myself lovingly, though I do not write them here. S.O.J. Chapter 1. Kate Lancaster's Plan. I had been spending the winter in Boston, and Kate Lancaster and I had been together a great deal, for we are the best of friends. It happened that the morning when this story begins, I had waked up feeling sorry, and as if something dreadful were going to happen. There did not seem to be any good reason for it, so I undertook to discourage myself more by thinking that it would soon be time to leave town, and how much I should miss being with Kate and my other friends. My mind was still disquieted when I went down to breakfast, but beside my plate I found, with a hoped-for letter from my father, a note from Kate. To this day I have never known any explanation of this depression of my spirits, and I hope that the good luck which followed will help some reader to lose fear, and to smile at such shadows, if any chance to come. Kate had evidently written to me in an excited state of mind, for her note was not so trig-looking as usual, but this is what she said. Dear Helen, I have a plan. I think it is a most delightful plan, in which you and I are chief characters. Promise that you will say yes. If you do not, you will have to remember all your life that you broke a girl's heart. Come round early and lunch with me and dine with me. I'm to be all alone, and it's a long story and will need a great deal of talking over. K. I showed this note to my aunt, and soon went round, very much interested. My latch-key opened the Lancasters' door, and I hurried to the parlor, where I heard my friend practising with great diligence. I went up to her, and she turned her head and kissed me solemnly. You need not smile. We are not sentimental girls, and are both much averse to indiscriminate kissing, though I have not the adroit habit of shying in which Kate is proficient. It would sometimes be impolite in any one else, but she shies so affectionately. "Won't you sit down, dear?" she said with great ceremony, and went on with her playing, which was abominable that morning. Her fingers stepped on each other, and whatever the tune might have been in reality, it certainly had a most remarkable incoherence as I heard it then. I took up the new Little, and made believe read it, and finally threw it at Kate. You would have thought we were two children. Have you heard that my grand-aunt, Miss Catherine Brandon of Deephaven, is dead? I knew that she had died in November, at least 6 months before. Don't be nonsensical, Kate, said I. What is it you are going to tell me? My grand-aunt died very old, and was the last of her generation. She had a sister and 3 brothers, one of whom had the honor of being my grandfather. Mamma is sole heir to the family estates in Deephaven, wharf property and all, and it is a great inconvenience to her. The house is a charming old house, and some of my ancestors who followed the sea brought home the greater part of its furnishings. Miss Catherine was a person who ignored all frivolities, and her house was as sedate as herself. I have been there but little, for when I was a child my aunt found no pleasure in the society of noisy children who upset her treasures, and when I was older she did not care to see strangers, and after I left school she grew more and more feeble. I had not been there for 2 years when she died. Mamma went down very often. The town is a quaint old place which has seen better days. There are high rocks at the shore, and there is a beach, and there are woods inland, and hills, and there is the sea. It might be dull in Deephaven for two young ladies who were fond of gay society and dependent upon excitement, I suppose, but for two little girls who were fond of each other and could play in the boats and dig and build houses in the sea sand, and gather shells and carry their dolls wherever they went, what could be pleasanter? "Nothing," said I, promptly. Kate had told this a little at a time, with a few appropriate bars of music between, which suddenly reminded me of the story of a Chinese procession which I had read in one of Marryat's novels when I was a child. "A thousand white elephants richly caparisoned, ti-tum tilly-lily," and so on for a page or two. She seemed to have finished her story for that time, and while it was dawning upon me what she meant, she sang a bit from one of Jean Ingelow's verses: "Will you step aboard, my dearest, for the high seas lie before us?" and then came over to sit beside me and tell the whole story in a more sensible fashion. You know that my father has been meaning to go to England in the autumn. Yesterday he told us that he is to leave in a month and will be away all summer, and mamma is going with him. Jack and Willie are to join a party of their classmates who are to spend nearly the whole of the long vacation at Lake Superior. I don't care to go abroad again now, and I did not like any plan that was proposed to me. Aunt Anna was here all the afternoon, and she is going to take the house at Newport, which is very pleasant and unexpected, for she hates housekeeping. Mamma thought, of course, that I would go with her, but I did not wish to do that, and it would only result in my keeping house for her visitors, whom I know very little, and she will be much more free and independent by herself. Beside, she can have my room if I am not there. I have promised to make her a long visit in Baltimore next winter instead. I told mamma that I should like to stay here and go away when I choose. There are ever so many visits which I have promised. I could stay with you and your Aunt Mary at Lenox if she goes there for a while, and I have always wished to spend a summer in town, but mamma did not encourage that at all. In the evening papa gave her a letter which had come from Mr. Dockum, the man who takes care of Aunt Catherine's place, and the most charming idea came into my head, and I said I meant to spend my summer in Deephaven. At first they laughed at me, and then they said I might go if I chose, and at last they thought nothing could be pleasanter, and mamma wishes she were going herself. I asked if she did not think you would be the best person to keep me company, and she does, and papa announced that he was just going to suggest my asking you. I am to take Anne and Maggie, who will be overjoyed, for they came from that part of the country, and the other servants are to go with Aunt Anna, and old Nora will come to take care of this house, as she always does. Perhaps you and I will come up to town once in a while for a few days. We shall have such jolly housekeeping. Mamma and I sat up very late last night, and everything is planned. Mr. Dockum's house is very near Aunt Catherine's, so we shall not be lonely, though I know you're no more afraid of that than I. Oh, Helen, won't you go?" "Do you think it took me long to decide?" Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster sailed the 10th of June, and my Aunt Mary went to spend her summer among the Berkshire hills, so I was at the Lancasters ready to welcome Kate when she came home, after having said good-bye to her mother and father. We meant to go to Deephaven in a week, but were obliged to stay in town longer. Boston was nearly deserted of our friends at the last, and we used to take quiet walks in the cool of the evening after dinner, up and down the street, or sit on the front steps in company with the servants left in charge of the other houses, who also sometimes walked up and down and looked at us wonderingly. We had much shopping to do in the daytime, for there was a probability of our spending many days indoors, and as we were not to be near any large town, and did not mean to come to Boston for weeks at least, there was a great deal to be remembered and arranged. We enjoyed making our plans and deciding what we should want, and going to the shops together. I think we felt most important the day we conferred with Anne and made out a list of the provisions which must be ordered. This was being housekeepers in earnest. Mr. Dockum happened to come to town, and we sent Anne and Maggie, with most of our boxes, to Deephaven in his company a day or two before we were ready to go ourselves, and when we reached there the house was opened and in order for us. On our journey to Deephaven we left the railway 12 miles from that place, and took passage in a stage-coach. There was only one passenger beside ourselves. She was a very large, thin, weather-beaten woman, and looked so tired and lonesome and good-natured that I could not help saying it was very dusty, and she was apparently delighted to answer that she should think everybody was sweeping, and she always felt, after being in the cars a while, as if she had been taken all to pieces and left in the different places, and this was the beginning of our friendship with Mrs. Kew. After this conversation we looked industriously out of the window into the pastures and pine woods. I had given up my seat to her, for I do not mind riding backward in the least, and you would have thought I had done her the greatest favor of her life. I think she was the most grateful of women, and I was often reminded of a remark one of my friends once made about someone. If you give Bessie a half sheet of letter paper, she behaves to you as if it were the most exquisite of presents. Kate and I had some fruit left in our lunch-basket, and divided it with Mrs. Kew, but after the first mouthful we looked at each other in dismay. "Lemons with oranges clothes on, aren't they?" said she, as Kate threw hers out of the window, and mine went after it for company. And after this we began to be very friendly indeed. We both liked the odd woman. There was something so straightforward and kindly about her. "Are you going to Deephaven, dear?" she asked me, and then, "I wonder if you are going to stay long, all summer? Well, that's clever. I do hope you will come out to the Light to see me. Young folks most always like my place. Most likely your friends will fetch you." "Do you know the Brandon house?" asked Kate. "Well as I do the meeting house. There! I wonder I didn't know from the beginning, but I have been a-trying all the way to settle it who you could be. I've been up country some weeks, stopping with my mother, and she seemed so set to have me stay till strawberry time, and would hardly let me come now. You see she's getting to be old. Why, every time I've come away for 15 years she said it was the last time I'd ever see her. But she's a dreadful smart woman of her age. He wrote me some o' Mrs. Lancaster's folks were going to take the Brandon house this summer, and so you are the ones. It's a sightly old place. I used to go and see Miss Katharine. She must have left a power of china-ware. She set a great deal by the house, and she kept everything just as it used to be in her mother's day." "Then you live in Deephaven too?" asked Kate. "I've been here the better part of my life. I was raised up among the hills in Vermont, and I shall always be a real up-country woman if I live here 100 years. The sea doesn't come natural to me. It kind of worries me, though you won't find a happier woman than I be, 'long shore. When I was first married, he had a schooner and went to the Banks, and once he was off on a whaling voyage, and I hope I may never come to so long a 3 years as those were again, though I was up to mother's. Before I was married he had been most everywhere. When he came home that time from whaling, he found I'd taken it so to heart that he said he'd never go off again, and then he got the chance to keep Deephaven Light, and we've lived there 17 years come January. There isn't great pay, but then nobody tries to get it away from us, and we've got so's to be contented, if it is lonesome in winter." "Do you really live in the lighthouse? I remember how I used to beg to be taken out there when I was a child, and how I used to watch for the light at night," said Kate enthusiastically. So began a friendship which we both still treasure, for knowing Mrs. Kew was one of the pleasantest things which happened to us in that delightful summer, and she used to do so much for our pleasure, and was so good to us. When we went out to the lighthouse for the last time to say good-by, we were very sorry girls indeed. We had no idea until then how much she cared for us, and her affection touched us very much. She told us that she loved us as if we belonged to her, and begged us not to forget her, as if we ever could, and to remember that there was always a home and a warm heart for us if she were alive. Kate and I have often agreed that few of our acquaintances are half so entertaining. Her comparisons were most striking and amusing, and her comments upon the books she read, for she was a great reader, were very shrewd and clever, and always to the point. She was never out of temper, even when the barrels of oil were being rolled across her kitchen floor, and she was such a wise woman. This stage ride, which we expected to find tiresome, we enjoyed very much, and we were glad to think, when the coach stopped, and he came to meet her with great satisfaction, that we had one friend in Deephaven at all events. I liked the house from my very first sight of it. It stood behind a row of poplars, which were as green and flourishing as the poplars which stand in stately procession in the fields around Quebec. It was an imposing great white house, and the lilacs were tall, and there were crowds of rose bushes not yet out of bloom, and there were box borders, and there were great elms at the side of the house and down the road. The hall door stood wide open, and my hostess turned to me as we went in, with one of her sweet sudden smiles. "Won't we have a good time, Nelly?" said she, and I thought we should. So our summer's housekeeping began in most pleasant fashion. It was just at sunset, and Ann's and Maggie's presence made the house seem familiar at once. Maggie had been unpacking for us, and there was a delicious supper ready for the hungry girls. Later in the evening we went down to the shore, which was not very far away. The fresh sea air was welcome after the dusty day, and it seemed so quiet and pleasant in Deephaven. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, in Marquette, Michigan, December 2007. Deephaven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 2. The Brandon House and the Lighthouse. I do not know that the Brandon House is anything very remarkable, but I never have been in one that interested me in the same way. Kate used to recount to select audiences at school some of her experiences with her Aunt Catherine, and it was popularly believed that she once carried down some indestructible picture books when they were first in fashion, and the old lady basted them for her to hem round the edges at the rate of 2 a day. It may have been fabulous. It was impossible to imagine any children in the old place. Everything was for grown people. Even the stair railing was too high to slide down on. The chairs looked as if they had been put, at the furnishing of the house, in their places, and there they meant to remain. The carpets were particularly interesting, and I remember Kate's pointing out to me one day a great square figure in one, and telling me she used to keep house there with her dolls for lack of a better playhouse, and if one of them chanced to fall outside the boundary stripe, it was immediately put to bed with a cold. It is a house with great possibilities. It might easily be made charming. There are 4 very large rooms on the lower floor, and 6 above, a wide hall in each story, and a fascinating garret over the whole, where were many mysterious old chests and boxes, in one of which we found Kate's grandmother's love letters. And you may be sure the vista of rummages which Mr. Lancaster had laughed about was explored to its very end. The rooms all have elaborate cornices, and the lower hall is very fine, with an archway dividing it, and panellings of all sorts, and a great door at each end, through which the lilacs in front and the old pensioner plum-trees in the garden are seen exchanging bows and gestures. Coming from the Lancasters' high city house, it did not seem as if we had to go upstairs at all there, for every step of the stairway is so broad and low, and you come half-way to a square landing, with an old straight-backed chair in each farther corner, and between them a large round-topped window with a cushioned seat, looking out on the garden and the village, the hills far inland, and the sunset beyond all. Then you turn and go up a few more steps to the upper hall, where we used to stay a great deal. There were more old chairs and a pair of remarkable sofas, on which we used to deposit the treasures collected in our wanderings. The wide window which looks out on the lilacs and the sea was a favorite seat of ours. Facing each other on the either side of it are two old secretaries, and one of them we ascertained to be the hiding-place of secret drawers, in which may be found valuable records deposited by ourselves one rainy day when we first explored it. We wrote, between us, a tragic journal on some yellow old letter-paper we found in the desk. We put it in the most hidden drawer by itself, and flatter ourselves that it will be regarded with great interest some time or other. Of one of the front rooms, the best chamber, we stood rather in dread. It is very remarkable that there seem to be no ghost stories connected with any part of the house, particularly this. We are neither of us nervous, but there is certainly something dismal about the room. The huge curtained bed and immense easy-chairs, windows, and everything were draped in some old-fashioned kind of white cloth, which always seemed to be waving and moving about of itself. The carpet was most singularly colored with dark reds and indescribable grays and browns, and the pattern, after a whole summer's study, could never be followed with one's eye. The paper was captured in a French prize somewhere, some time in the last century, and part of the figure was shaggy, and therein little spiders found habitation, and went visiting their acquaintances across the shiny places. The color was an unearthly pink, and a forbidding maroon, with dim white spots, which gave it the appearance of having moulded. It made you low-spirited to look long in the mirror, and the great lounge one could not have cheerful associations with, after hearing that Miss Brandon herself did not like it, having seen so many of her relatives lie there dead. There were fantastic china ornaments from Bible subjects on the mantel, and the only picture was one of the Maid of Orleans, tied with an unusually strong rope to a very stout stake. The best parlor we also rarely used, because all the portraits which hung there had for some unaccountable reason taken a violent dislike to us, and followed us suspiciously with their eyes. The furniture was stately and very uncomfortable, and there was something about the room which suggested an invisible funeral. There is not very much to say about the dining-room. It was not specially interesting, though the sea was in sight from one of the windows. There were some old Dutch pictures on the wall, so dark that one could scarcely make out what they were meant to represent, and one or two engravings. There was a huge sideboard, for which Kate had brought down from Boston Miss Brandon's own silver, which had stood there for so many years, and looked so much more at home and in place than any other possibly could have looked, and Kate also found in the closet the 3 great decanters with silver labels chained round their necks, which had always been the companions of the tea service in her aunt's lifetime. From the little closets in the sideboard there came a most significant odor of cake and wine whenever one opened the doors. We used Miss Brandon's beautiful old blue India china, which she had given to Kate, and which had been carefully packed all winter. Kate sat at the head and I at the foot of the round table, and I must confess that we were apt to have either a feast or a famine, for at first we often forgot to provide our dinners. If this were the case, Maggie was sure to serve us with most derisive elegance, and made us wait for as much ceremony as she thought necessary for one of Mrs. Lancaster's dinner parties. The west parlor was our favorite room downstairs. It had a great fireplace framed in blue and white Dutch tiles, which ingeniously and instructively represented the careers of the good and the bad man, the starting place of each being a very singular cradle in the centre, at the top. The last 2 of the series are very high art. A great coffin stands in the foreground of each, and the virtuous man is being led off by 2 disagreeable-looking angels, while the wicked one is hastening from an indescribable but unpleasant assemblage of claws and horns and eyes which is rapidly advancing from the distance, open-mouthed and bringing a chain with it. There was a large cabinet holding all the small curiosities and knick-knacks there seemed to be no other place for, odd china figures and cups and vases, unaccountable Chinese carvings and exquisite corals and sea-shells, minerals and Swiss woodwork, and articles of virtu from the South Seas. Underneath were stored boxes of letters and old magazines, for this was one of the houses where nothing seems to have been thrown away. In one parting we found a parcel of old manuscript sermons, the existence of which was a mystery, until Kate remembered there had been a gifted son of the house who entered the ministry and soon died. The windows had each a pane of stained glass, and on the wide sills we used to put our immense bouquets of field flowers. There was one place which I liked and sat in more than any other. The chimney filled nearly the whole side of the room, all but this little corner, where there was just room for a very comfortable high-backed cushioned chair, and a narrow window, where I always had a bunch of fresh green ferns in a tall champagne glass. I used to write there often, and always sat there when Kate sang and played. She sent for a tuner, and used to successfully coax the long-imprisoned music from the antiqued piano, and sing for her visitors by the hour. She almost always sang her oldest songs, for they seemed most in keeping with everything about us. I used to fancy that the portraits liked our being there. There was one young girl who seemed solitary and forlorn among the rest in the room, who were all middle-aged. For their part they looked amiable, but rather unhappy, as if she had come in and interrupted their conversation. We both grew very fond of her, and it seemed, when we went in the last morning on purpose to take leave of her, as if she looked at us imploringly. She was soon afterward boxed up, and now enjoys society after her own heart in Kate's room in Boston. There was the largest sofa I ever saw opposite the fireplace. It must have been brought in pieces and built in the room. It was broad enough for Kate and me to lie on together, and very high and square, but there was a pile of soft cushions at one end. We used to enjoy it greatly in September, when the evenings were long and cool, and we had many candles and a fire, and crickets too on the hearth, and the dear dog lying on the rug. I remember one rainy night, just before Miss Tennant and Kitty Bruce went away, we had a real driftwood fire, and blew out the lights and told stories. Miss Margaret knows so many and tells them so well. Kate and I were unusually entertaining, for we became familiar with the family record of the town, and could recount marvellous adventures by land and sea, and ghost stories by the dozen. We had never either of us been in a society consisting of so many travelled people. Hardly a man but had been the most of his life at sea. Speaking of ghost stories, I must tell you that once in the summer 2 Cambridge girls, who were spending a week with us, unwisely enticed us into giving some thrilling recitals, which nearly frightened them out of their wits, and Kate and I were finally in terror ourselves. We had all been on the sofa in the dark, singing and talking, and were waiting in great suspense after I had finished one of such particular horror that I declared it should be the last, when we heard footsteps on the hall stairs. There were lights in the dining-room, which shone faintly through the half-closed door, and we saw something white and shapeless come slowly down, and clutched each other's gowns in agony. It was only Kate's dog, who came in and laid his head on her lap, and slept peacefully. We thought we could not sleep a wink after this, and I bravely went alone out to the light to see my watch, and finding it was past 12, we concluded to sit up all night, and to go down to the shore at sunrise. It would be so much easier than getting up early some morning. We had been out rowing, and had taken a long walk the day before, and were obliged to dance and make other slight exertions to keep ourselves awake at one time. We lunched at 2, and I never shall forget the sunrise that morning. But we were singularly quiet and abstracted that day, and indeed for several days after Deephaven was a land in which it seemed always afternoon, we breakfasted so late. As Mrs. Kew had said, there was a power of china. Kate and I were convinced that the lives of her grandmothers must have been spent in giving tea parties. We counted 10 sets of cups, beside quantities of stray ones, and some member of the family had evidently devoted her time to making a collection of pitchers. There was an escritoire in Miss Brandon's own room, which we looked over one day. There was a little package of letters, ship letters mostly, tied with a very pale and tired-looking blue ribbon. They were in a drawer with a locket holding a faded miniature on ivory and a lock of brown hair, and there were also some dry twigs and bits of leaf which had long ago been dried wild roses, such as still bloom among the Deephaven rocks. Kate said that she had often heard her mother wonder why her aunt never had cared to marry, for she had chances enough, doubtless, and had been rich and handsome and finely educated. So there was a sailor lover after all, and perhaps he had been lost at sea, and she faithfully kept the secret, never mourning outwardly. "And I always thought her the most matter-of-fact old lady," said Kate. "Yet here's her romance after all." We put the letters outside on a chair to read, but afterwards carefully replaced them, without untying them. I'm glad we did. There were other letters which we did read, and which interested us very much, letters from her girl friends written in the boarding-school vacations, and just after she finished school. Those in one of the similar packages were charming. It must have been such a bright, nice girl who wrote them. They were very few, and were tied with black ribbon, and marked on the outside in girlish writing, "My dearest friend Dolly McAllister died September 3, 1809, aged 18." The ribbon had evidently been untied, and the letters read many times. One began, "My dear delightful kitten, I am quite overjoyed to find my father has business which will force him to go to Deephaven next week, and he kindly says, if there be no more rain I may ride with him to see you. I will surely come, for if there is danger of spattering my gown, and he bids me stay at home, I shall go galloping after him and overtake him when it is too late to send me back. I have so much to tell you." I wish I knew more about the visit. Poor Miss Katharine! It made us sad to look over these treasures of her girlhood. There were her compositions and exercise books, some samplers and queer little keepsakes, withered flowers and some pebbles, and other things of like value, with which there was probably some pleasant association. "Only think of her keeping them all her days," said I to Kate. "I am continually throwing some relic of the kind away, because I forget why I have it." There was a box in the lower part which Kate was glad to find, for she had heard her mother wonder if some such things were not in existence. It held a crucifix and a mass book and some rosaries, and Kate told me Miss Katharine's youngest and favorite brother had become a Roman Catholic while studying in Europe. It was a dreadful blow to the family, for in those days there could have been few deeper disgraces to the Brandon family than to have one of its sons go over to popery. Only Miss Katharine treated him with kindness, and after a time he disappeared without telling even her where he was going, and was only heard from indirectly once or twice afterward. It was a great grief to her. "And mamma knows," said Kate, "that she always had a lingering hope of his return, for one of the last times she saw Aunt Catherine before she was ill, she spoke of soon going to be with all the rest, and said, 'Though your Uncle Henry, dear,' and stopped and smiled sadly. 'You'll think me a very foolish old woman, but I never quite gave up thinking he might come home.'" Mrs. Kew did the honors of the lighthouse thoroughly on our first visit, but I think we rarely went to see her that we did not make some entertaining discovery. Mr. Kew's nephew, a guileless youth of 40, lived with them, and the two men were of a mechanical turn, and had invented numerous aids to housekeeping, appendages to the stove, and fixtures on the walls for everything that could be hung up, catches in the floor to hold the doors open, and ingenious apparatus to close them, but above all a system of barring and bolting for the wide fore-door, which would have disconcerted an energetic battering-ram. After all this work being expended, Mrs. Kew informed us that it was usually wide open all night in summer weather. On the back of this door I discovered one day a row of marks, and asked their significance. It seemed that Mrs. Kew had attempted one summer to keep count of the number of people who inquired about the depredations of the neighbors' chickens. Mrs. Kew's bedroom was partly devoted to the fine arts. There was a large collection of likenesses of her relatives and friends on the wall, which was interesting in the extreme. Mrs. Kew was always much pleased to tell their names, and her remarks about any feature not exactly perfect were very searching and critical. "That's my oldest brother's wife, Clorinthy Adams, that was. She's well featured, if it were not for that nose, and that looks as if it had been thrown at her, and she wasn't particular about having it on firm, in hopes of getting a better one. She sets by her looks, though." There were often sailing parties that came there from up and down the coast. One day Kate and I were spending the afternoon at the Light. We had been fishing, and were sitting in the doorway listening to a reminiscence of the winter Mrs. Kew kept school at the Four Corners, saw a boatful coming, and all lost our tempers. Mrs. Kew had a lame ankle, and Kate offered to go up with the visitors. There were some girls and young men who stood on the rocks a while, and then asked us, with much better manners than the people who usually came, if they could see the lighthouse, and Kate led the way. She was dressed that day in a costume we both frequently wore, of gray skirts and blue sailor jacket, and her boots were much the worse for wear. The celebrated Lancaster complexion was rather darkened by the sun. Mrs. Kew expressed a wish to know what questions they would ask her, and I followed after a few minutes. They seemed to have finished asking about the lantern, and to have become personal. "Don't you get tired staying here?" "No, indeed," said Kate. "Is that your sister downstairs?" "No, I have no sister." "I should think you would wish she was. Aren't you ever lonesome?" "Everybody is sometimes," said Kate. "But it's such a lonesome place," said one of the girls. "I should think you would get work away. I live in Boston. Why, it's so awful quiet, nothing but the water and the wind when it blows, and I think either of them is worse than nothing, and only this little bit of a rocky place. I should want to go for a walk." I heard Kate pleasantly refuse the offer of pay for her services, and then they began to come down the steep stairs laughing and chattering with each other. Kate stayed behind to close the doors and leave everything all right, and the girl who had talked the most waited too, and when they were on the stairs just above me and the others out of hearing, she said, "You're real good to show us the things. I guess you'll think I'm silly, but I do like you ever so much. I wish you would come to Boston. I'm in a real nice store, H's, on Winter Street, and they will want new saleswomen in October. Perhaps you could be at my counter. I'd teach you, and you could board with me. I've got a real comfortable room, and I suppose I might have more things, for I get good pay. But I like to send money home to mother. I'm at my aunt's now, but I am going back next Monday, and if you will tell me what your name is, I'll find out for certain about the place and write you. My name's Mary Wendell." I knew by Kate's voice that she had touched her. "You are very kind, thank you heartily," said she, "but I cannot go and work with you. I should like to know more about you. I live in Boston, too. My friend and I are staying over in Deephaven for the summer only." And she held out her hand to the girl, whose face had changed from its first expression of earnest good humor to a very startled one, and when she noticed Kate's hand and a ring of hers, which had been turned round, she looked really frightened. "Oh, will you please excuse me?" said she, blushing. "I ought to have known better, but you showed us round so willing, and I never thought of your not living here. I didn't mean to be rude." "Of course you did not, and you were not. I'm very glad you said it, and glad you like me," said Kate, and just then the party called the girl, and she hurried away, and I joined Kate. "Then you heard it all? That was worth having," said she. "She was such an honest little soul, and I mean to look for her when I get home." Sometimes we used to go out to the Light early in the morning, with the fishermen who went that way to the fishing grounds, but we usually made the voyage early in the afternoon if it were not too hot, and we went fishing off the rocks or sat in the house with Mrs. Kew, who often related some of her Vermont experiences, or Mr. Kew would tell us surprising sea stories and ghost stories like a story-book sailor. Then we would have an unreasonably good supper, and afterward climb the ladder to the lantern to see the lamps lighted, and sit there for a while, watching the ships and the sunset. Almost all the coasters came in sight of Deephaven, and the sea outside the light was their grand highway. Twice from the lighthouse we saw a yacht squadron, like a flock of great white birds. As for the sunsets, it used to seem often as if we were near the heart of them, for the sea all around us caught the color of the clouds, and though the glory was wonderful, I remember best one still evening when there was a bank of heavy gray clouds in the west, shutting down like a curtain, and the sea was silver-colored. You could look under and beyond the curtain of clouds into the palest, clearest yellow sky. There was a little black boat in the distance drifting slowly, climbing one white wave after another, as if it were bound out into that other world beyond. But presently the sun came from behind the clouds, and the dazzling golden light changed the look of everything, and it was the time then to say one thought it a beautiful sunset, while before one could only keep very still and watch the boat, and wonder if heaven would not be somehow like that far faint color which was neither sea nor sky. When we came down from the lighthouse and it grew late, we would beg for an hour or two longer on the water, and row away in the twilight, far out from land, where, with our faces turned from the light, it seemed as if we were alone, and the sea shoreless, and as the darkness closed round us softly, we watched the stars come out, and were always glad to see Kate's star and my star, which we had chosen when we were children. I used long ago to be sure of one thing, that however far away heaven might be, it could not be out of sight of the stars. Sometimes in the evening we waited out at sea for the moonrise, and then we would take the oars again and go slowly in, once in a while singing or talking, but oftenest silent. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, in Marquette, Michigan, June 2008. Deephaven, by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 3. My Lady Brandon and the Widow Jim. When it was known that we had arrived in Deephaven, the people who had known Miss Brandon so well, and Mrs. Lancaster also, seemed to consider themselves Kate's friends by inheritance, and were exceedingly polite to us, in either calling upon us or sending pleasant messages. Before the first week had ended we had no lack of society. They were not strangers to Kate to begin with, and as for me, I think it is easy for me to be contented, and to feel at home anywhere. I have the good fortune and the misfortune to belong to the Navy, that is, my father does, and my life has been consequently an unsettled one, except during the years of my school life when my friendship with Kate began. I think I should be happy in any town if I were living there with Kate Lancaster. I will not praise my friend as I can praise her, or say half the things I might say honestly. She is so fresh and good and true, and enjoys life so heartily. She is so childlike without being childish, and I do not tell her that she is faultless, but when she makes mistakes she is sorrier and more ready to hopefully try again than any girl I know. Perhaps you would like to know something about us, but I am not writing Kate's biography and my own, only telling you of one summer which we spent together. Sometimes in Deephaven we were between 6 and 7 years old, but at other times we have felt irreparably grown up, and as if we carried a crushing weight of care and duty. In reality we are both 24, and it is a pleasant age, though I think next year is sure to be pleasanter, for we do not mind growing older, since we have lost nothing that we mourn about, and are gaining so much. I shall be glad if you learn to know Kate a little in my stories. It is not that I am fond of her and endow her with imagined virtues and graces, no one can fail to see how unaffected she is, or not notice her thoughtfulness and generosity and her delightful fun, which never has a trace of coarseness or silliness. It was very pleasant having her for one's companion, for she has an unusual power of winning people's confidence, and of knowing with surest instinct how to meet them on their own ground. It is the girl's being so genuinely sympathetic and interested which makes every one ready to talk to her and be friends with her, just as the sunshine makes it easy for flowers to grow which the chilly winds hinder. She is not polite for the sake of seeming polite, but polite for the sake of being kind, and there is not a particle of what Hugh Miller justly calls the insolence of condescension about her. She is not brilliantly talented, yet she does everything in a charming fashion of her own. She is not profoundly learned, yet she knows much of which many wise people are ignorant. And while she is a patient scholar in both little things and great, she is no less a teacher to all her friends. Dear Kate Lancaster! We knew that we were considered Miss Brandon's representatives in Deephaven society, and this was no slight responsibility, as she had received much honor and respect. We heard again and again what a loss she had been to the town, and we tried that summer to do nothing to lessen the family reputation, and to give pleasure as well as take it, though we were singularly persistent in our pursuit of a good time. I grew much interested in what I heard of Miss Brandon, and it seems to me that it is a great privilege to have an elderly person in one's neighborhood, in town or country, who is proud and conservative, and who lives in stately fashion, who is intolerant of sham and of useless novelties, and clings to the old ways of living and behaving as if it were part of her religion. There is something immensely respectable about the gentlewomen of the old school. They ignore all bustle and flashiness, and the conceit of the younger people, who act as if at last it had been time for them to appear and manage this world as it ought to have been managed before. Their position in modern society is much like that of the King's Chapel in its busy street in Boston. It perhaps might not have been easy to approach Miss Brandon, but I am sure that if I had visited in Deephaven during her lifetime, I should have been very proud if I had been asked to take tea at her house, and should have liked to speak afterward of my acquaintance with her. It would have been impossible not to pay her great deference. It is a pleasure to think that she must have found this world a most polite world, and have had the highest opinion of its good manners. Noblesse oblige, that is true in more ways than one. I cannot help wondering if those of us who will be left by and by to represent our own generation will seem to have such superior elegance of behavior, if we shall receive so much respect and be so much valued. It is hard to imagine it. We know that the world gains new refinements and a better culture, but to us there never will be such imposing ladies and gentlemen as those who belong to the old school. The morning after we reached Deephaven, we were busy upstairs, and there was a determined blow at the knocker of the front door. I went down to see who was there, and had the pleasure of receiving our first caller. She was a prim little old woman, who looked pleased and expectant, who wore a neat cap and front, and whose eyes were as bright as black beads. She wore no bonnet, and had thrown a little three-cornered shawl with palm-leaf figures over her shoulders, and it was evident that she was a near neighbor. She was very short and straight and thin, and so quick that she darted like a pickerel when she moved about. It occurred to me at once that she was a very capable person and had faculty, and dear me, how fast she talked! She hesitated a moment when she saw me, and dropped a fragment of a courtesy. "Miss Lancaster?" said she doubtfully. "No," said I. "I'm Miss Dennis. Miss Lancaster is at home, though. Come in, won't you?" "Oh, Mrs. Patton!" said Kate, who came down just then. "How very kind of you to come over so soon! I should have gone to see you to-day. I was asking Mrs. Kew last night if you were here." "Land o' compassion!" said Mrs. Patton, as she shook Kate's hand delightedly. "Where d'ye s'pose I'd be, dear? I ain't like to move away from Deephaven now, after I've held by the place so long. I've got as many roots as the deep ellum. Well, I should know you were a Brandon, no matter where I see you. You've got a real Brandon look. Tall and straight, ain't you? It's 4 or 5 years since I saw you, except once at church, and once you went by down to the shore, I suppose. It was a windy day in the spring of the year." "I remember it very well," said Kate. "Those were both visits of only a day or two, and I was here at Aunt Catherine's funeral, and went away that same evening. Do you remember once I was here in the summer for a longer visit, 5 or 6 years ago, and I helped you pick currants in the garden? You had a very old mug. Now whoever would 'a' thought o' your recollecting that?" said Mrs. Patton. "Yes, I had that mug because it was handy to carry about among the bushes, and then I'd empty it into the basket as fast as I got it full. Your aunt always told me to pick all I wanted. She couldn't use 'em, but they used to make sights o' currant wine in old times. I suppose that mug would be considerable of a curiosity to anybody that wasn't used to seeing it round. My grand'ther Joseph Toggerson, my mother was a Toggerson, picked it up on the long sands in a wad of seaweed. Strange it wasn't broke, but it's tough. I've dropped it on the floor many's the time, and it ain't even chipped. There's some Dutch reading on it, and it's marked 1732. Now I shouldn't ha' thought you'd remembered that old mug, I declare. Your mother, she had a monstrous sight of chiny. She's told me where most all of it come from, but I expect I've forgot. My memory fails me a good deal by spells. If you hadn't come down, I suppose your mother would have had the chiny packed up this spring, what she didn't take with her after your aunt died. Suppose she hasn't made up her mind what to do with the house?" "No," said Kate. "She wishes she could. It is a great puzzle to us." "I hope you will find it in middling order," said Mrs. Patton humbly. "Me and Mrs. Dockum had done the best we knew, opened the windows and let in the air and tried to keep it from getting damp. I fixed all the woolens with fresh camphor and tobacco the last of the winter. You have to be dreadful careful in one of these old houses, 'less everything gets creaking with moths in no time. Miss Katharine, how she did hate the sight of a moth miller! There's something I'll speak about before I forget it. The mice have eat the backs of a pile o' old books that's stored away in the west chamber closet, next to Miss Katharine's room, and I set a trap there. But it was older'n the 10 Commandments, that trap was, and the spring's rusty. I guess you'd better get some new ones and set round in different places, lest the mice'll pester you. There ain't been no chance for 'em to get much of a living long through the winter, but they'll be sure to come back quick as they find there's likely to be good board. I see your aunt's cat setting out on the front steps. She never was no great of a mouser, but it went to my heart to see how pleased she looks. Come right back, didn't she? How they do hold to their old haunts!" "Was that Miss Brandon's cat?" I asked with great interest. "She has been upstairs with us, but I supposed she belonged to some neighbor and had strayed in. She behaved as if she felt at home, poor old pussy." "We must keep her here," said Kate. "Miss Dockum took her after your mother went off and Miss Katharine's maids," said Miss Patton, "but she told me that it was a long spell before she seemed to feel contented. She used to set on the steps and cry by the hour together, and try to get in, first one door and then another. I used to think how bad Miss Katharine would feel. She set a great deal by a cat, and she took notice of this as long as she did of anything. Her mind failed her, you know. Great loss to Deephaven she was. Proud woman, and some folks were scared of her, but I always got along with her, and I wouldn't ask for no kinder friend nor neighbor. I've had my troubles, and I've seen the day I was suffering poor, and I couldn't have brought myself to ask town help nohow. But I wish ye had heard her scold me when she found it out, and she come marching into my kitchen one morning like a grenadier, and says she, 'Why didn't you send and tell me how sick and poor you are?' says she, and she said she'd ha' been so glad to help me all along, but she thought I had means, everybody did, and I see the tears in her eyes, but she was scolding me and speaking as if she was dreadful mad. She made me comfortable, and she sent over one o' her maids to see to me, and got the doctor and a load of stuff come up from the store, so I didn't have to buy anything for a good many weeks. I got better, and so's to work, but she never'd let me say nothing about it. I had a good deal o' trouble, and I thought I'd lost my health, but I hadn't, and that was 30 or 40 years ago. There never was nothing going on at the great house that she didn't have me over, sewing or cleaning or company, and I got so that I knew how she liked to have things done. I felt as if it was my own sister, though I'd never had one, when I was going over to help lay her out. She used to talk as free to me as she would to Miss Lorimer or Miss Carew. I suppose ye ain't seen nothing of them yet. She was a good Christian woman, Miss Katharine was. The memory of the just is blessed. That's what Mr. Lorimer said in his sermon the Sunday after she died, and there wasn't a blood relation there to hear it. I declare it looked pitiful to see that pew empty that ought to ha' been the mourner's pew. Your mother, Miss Lancaster, had to go home Saturday. Your father was going away sudden to Washington, I've understood, and she'd come back again the first of the week. There! It didn't make no sort of difference. Perhaps nobody thought of it but me. There hadn't been anybody in the pew more than a couple of times since she used to sit there herself, regular as Sunday come." And Mrs. Patton looked for a minute as if she were going to cry, but she changed her mind upon second thought. "Your mother gave me most of Miss Katharine's clothes. This cap belonged to her that I've got on now. It's most wore out, but it does for mornings." "Oh," said Kate, "I have 2 new ones for you in one of my trunks. Mamma meant to choose them herself, but she had not time, and so she told me, and I think I found the kind she thought you would like." "Now I'm sure," said Mrs. Patton, "if that ain't kind! You don't tell me that Mis' Lancaster thought of me just as she was going off? I shall set everything by them caps, and I'm much obliged to you, Miss Kate. I was just going to speak of that time you were here and saw the mug. You trimmed a cap for Miss Katharine to give me, real Boston style. I guess that box of cap fixings is up on the top shelf of Miss Katharine's closet now, to the left hand," said Mrs. Patton, with wistful certainty. "She used to make her every-day caps herself, and she had some beautiful materials laid away that she never used. Some folks has laughed at me for being so particular about wearing caps except for best, but I don't know it's presuming beyond my station, and somehow I feel more respect for myself when I have a good cap on. I can't get over your mother's recollecting about me. And she sent me a handsome present of money this spring for looking after the house. I never should have asked for a cent. It's a pleasure to me to keep an eye on it, out of respect to your aunt. I was so pleased when I heard you were coming 'long o' your friend. I like to see the old place open. It was about as bad as having no meeting. I miss seeing the lights, and your aunt was a great hand for lighting up bright. The big hall lantern was lit every night, and she put it out when she went upstairs. She liked to go round same's if it was day. You see, I forget all the time she was sick, and go back to the days when she was well and about the house. When her mind was failing her, and she was upstairs in her room, her eyesight seemed to be lost part of the time, and sometimes she'd tell us to get the lamp and a couple of candles in the middle of the day, and then she'd be as satisfied. But she used to take a notion to set in the dark some nights, and think, I s'pose. I should have 40 fits if I undertook it. That was a good while ago. And do you recollect how she used to play the piano? She used to be a great hand to play when she was young." "Indeed I remember it," said Kate, who told me afterward how her aunt used to sit at the piano in the twilight and play to herself. "She was formerly a skilled musician," said my friend, "though one would not have imagined she cared for music. When I was a child she used to play in company of an evening, and once when I was here one of her friends asked for a tune, and she laughingly said that her day was over and her fingers were stiff, though I believe she might have played as well as ever then, if she had cared to try. But once in a while, when she had been quiet all day and rather sad, I am ashamed that I used to think she was cross, she would open the piano and sit there until late, while I used to be enchanted by her memories of dancing tunes, and old psalms, and marches and songs. There was one tune which I am sure had a history. There was a sweet wild cadence in it, and she would come back to it again and again, always going through with it in the same measured way. I have remembered so many things about my aunt since I have been here," said Kate, "which I hardly noticed and did not understand when they happened. I was afraid of her when I was a little girl, but I think if I had grown up sooner I would have enjoyed her heartily. It never used to occur to me that she had a spark of tenderness or of sentiment. until just before she was ill, but I have been growing more fond of her ever since. I might have given her a great deal more pleasure. It was not long after I was through school that she became so feeble, and of course she liked best having mamma come to see her. One of us had to be at home. I have thought lately how careful one ought to be kind and thoughtful to one's old friends. It is so soon too late to be good to them, and then one is always so sorry. I must tell you more of Mrs. Patton. Of course it was not long before we returned her call, and we were much entertained. We always liked to see our friends in their own houses. Her house was a little way down the road, unpainted and gambrel roofed, but so low that the old lilac bushes which clustered round it were as tall as the eaves. The Widow Jim, as nearly every one called her in distinction to the Widow Jack Patton, who was a tailoress and lived at the other end of the town, was a very useful person. I suppose there must be her counterpart in all old New England villages. She sewed, and she made elaborate rugs, and she had a decided talent for making carpets, if there were one to be made, which must have happened seldom. But there were a great many to be turned and made over in Deephaven, and she went to the Carews and Lorimers at house-cleaning time or in seasons of great festivity. She had no equal in sickness, and knew how to brew every old-fashioned dose and to make every variety of herb tea, and when her nursing was put to an end by her patient's death, she was commander-in-chief at the funeral, and stood near the doorway to direct the mourning friends to their seats, and I have no reason to doubt that she sometimes even had the immense responsibility of making out the order of the procession, since she had all genealogy and relationship at her tongue's end. It was an awful thing in Deephaven, we found, if the precedence was wrongly assigned, and once we chanced to hear some bitter remarks because the cousins of the departed wife had been placed after the husband's relatives. The blood relations riding behind them that was only kin by marriage. I don't wonder they felt hurt, said the person who spoke, a most unselfish and unassuming soul ordinarily. Mrs. Patton knew everybody's secrets, but she told them judiciously, if at all. She chattered all day to you as a sparrow twitters, and you did not tire of her. And Kate and I were never more agreeably entertained than when she told us of old times and of Kate's ancestors and their contemporaries, for her memory was wonderful, and she had either seen everything that had happened in Deephaven for a long time, or had received the particulars from reliable witnesses. She had known much trouble. Her husband had been but small satisfaction to her, and it was not to be wondered at if she looked upon all proposed marriages with compassion. She was always early at church, and she wore the same bonnet that she had when Kate was a child. It was such a well-preserved, proper black straw bonnet, with discreet bows of ribbons, and a useful lace veil to protect it from the weather. She showed us into the best room the first time we went to see her. It was the plainest little room and very dull, and there was an exact sufficiency about its furnishings. Yet there was a certain dignity about it. It was unmistakably a best room, and not a place where one might make a litter or carry one's everyday work. You felt at once that somebody valued the prim old-fashioned chairs, and the 2 half-moon tables, and the thin carpet, which must have needed anxious stretching every spring to make it come to the edge of the floor. There were some mourning pieces by way of decoration, inscribed with the names of Mrs. Patton's departed friends, 2 worked in crewel to the memory of her father and mother, and 2 paper memorials, with the women weeping under the willow at the side of a monument. They were all brown with age, and there was a sampler beside, worked by Judith Beckett, aged 10, and all 5 were framed in slender black frames and hung very high on the walls. There was a rocking chair which looked as if it felt too grand for use, and considered itself imposing. It tilted far back on its rockers, and was bent forward at the top to make one's head uncomfortable. It need not have troubled itself. Nobody would ever wish to sit there. It was such a big rocking chair, and Mrs. Patton was proud of it, always generously urging her guests to enjoy its comfort, which was imaginary with her, as she was so short that she could hardly have climbed into it without assistance. Mrs. Patton was a little ceremonious at first, but soon recovered herself and told us a great deal which we were glad to hear. I asked her once if she had not always lived in Deephaven. "Here and beyond East Parish," said she. "Mr. Patton, that was my husband, he owned a good farm there when I married him, but I come back here again after he died. Place was all mortgaged. I never got a cent, and I was poorer than when I started. I worked harder'n ever I did before or since to keep things together, but 'twasn't any kind of use. Your mother knows all about it, Miss Kate," as if we might not be willing to believe it on her authority. "I come back here a widow and destitute. I tell you the world looked fair to me when I left this house first to go over there. Don't you run no risks. You're better off as you be, dears. But land sakes alive, he didn't mean no hurt, and he set everything by me when he was himself. I don't make no scruples of speaking about it. Everybody knows how it was, but I did go through with everything. I never knew what the day would bring forth," said the widow, as if this were the first time she had had a chance to tell her sorrows to a sympathizing audience. She did not seem to mind talking about the troubles of her married life any more than a soldier minds telling the story of his campaigns, and dwells with pride on the worst battle of all. Her favorite subject always was Miss Brandon, and after a pause she said that she hoped we were finding everything right in the house. She had meant to take up the carpet in the best spare room, but it didn't seem to need it. It was taken up the year before, and the room had not been used since. There was not a mite of dust under it last time, and Kate assured her, with an appearance of great wisdom, that she did not think it could be necessary at all. "I come home and had a good cry yesterday after I was over to seeing you," said Mrs. Patton, and I could not help wondering if she really could cry, for she looked so perfectly dried up, so dry that she might rustle in the wind. "Your aunt had been failing so long that just after she died it was a relief, but I've got so's to forget all about that, and I miss her as she used to be. It seemed as if you had stepped into her place, and you look some as she used to when she was young." "You must miss her," said Kate, "and I know how much she used to depend on you. You were very kind to her." "I sat up with her the night she died," said the widow, with mournful satisfaction. "I have lived neighbor to her all my life except the 13 years I was married, and there wasn't a week I wasn't over to the great house except I was off to a distance taking care of the sick. When she got to be feeble she always wanted me to tend to the cleaning and to see to putting the canopies and curtains on the bedsteads, and she wouldn't trust nobody but me to handle some of the best china. I used to say, 'Miss Katharine, why don't you have some young folks come and stop with you? There's Miss Lancaster's daughter a-growing up,' but she didn't seem to care for anybody but your mother. You wouldn't believe what a hand she used to be for company in her younger days. Surprising how folks alters. When I first recollect her much, she was as straight as an arrow, and she used to go to Boston visiting and come home with the top of the fashion. She always did dress elegant. It used to be gay here, and she was always going down to the Lorimers or the Carews to tea, and they coming here. Her sister was married. She was a good deal older, but some of her brothers were at home. There was her grandfather and Mr. Henry. I don't think she ever got over it, his disappearing so. There were lots of folks then that's dead and gone, and they used to have their card parties, and old Cap'n Manning, he's dead and gone, used to have 'em all to play whist every fortnight, sometimes 3 or 4 tables, and they always had cake and wine handed round, or the captain'd make some punch, like's not, with oranges in it and lemons. He knew how. He was a bachelor to the end of his days, the old cap'n was, but he used to entertain real handsome. I recollect one night they was a-playing after the wine was brought in, and he upset his glass all over Miss Martha Lorimer's invisible green watered silk, and spoilt the better part of 2 breadths. She sent right over for me early the next morning to see if I knew of anything to take out the spots, but I didn't, though I can take grease out of most any material. We tried clear alcohol and saleratus water and hartshorn, and pouring water through and heating off it, and when we got through it was worse than when we started. She felt dreadful bad about it, and at last she says, 'Judith, we won't work over it any more, but if you will give me a day some time or 'nother, We'll rip it up and make a quilt of it. I see that quilt last time I was in Miss Rebecca's north chamber. Miss Martha was her aunt. You never saw her. She was dead and gone before your day. It was a silk old Cap'n Peter Lorimer, her brother, who left him his money, brought home from sea, and she had worn it for best and second best 11 years. It looked as good as new, and she never would have ripped it up if she could have matched it. I said it seemed to be a shame, but it was a curious figure. Cap'n Manning fetched her one to pay for it the next time he went to Boston. She didn't want to take it, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He was free-handed, the captain was. I helped 'em make it long of Miss Mary Ann Sims, the dressmaker. She's dead and gone too, the time it was made. It was brown and a beautiful-looking piece, but it wore shiny, and she made a double gown of it before she died. Mrs. Patton brought Kate and me some delicious old-fashioned cake with much spice in it, and told us it was made by old Mrs. Chantry Brandon's recipe, which she got in England, that it would keep a year, and she always kept a loaf by her now that she could afford it. She supposed we knew Miss Catherine had named her in her will long before she was sick. "It has put me beyond fear of want," said Mrs. Patton. "I won't deny that I used to think it would go hard with me when I got so old I couldn't earn my living. You see, I never laid up but a little, and it's hard for a woman who comes of respectable folks to be a pauper in her last days. But your aunt, Miss Kate, she thought of it too, and I'm sure I'm thankful to be so comfortable, and to stay in my house, which I couldn't have done, like's not. Miss Rebecca Lorimer said to me after I got news of the will, 'Why, Miss Patton, you don't suppose your friends would ever have let you want?' And I says, 'My friends are kind, the Lord bless 'em, but I feel better to be able to do for myself than to be beholden.'" After this long call we went down to the post office, and coming home stopped for a while in the old burying-ground, which we had noticed the day before, and we sat for the first time on the great stone in the wall, in the shade of a maple tree, where we so often waited afterward for the stage to come with the mail, or rested on our way home from a walk. It was a comfortable perch. We used to read our letters there, I remember. I must tell you a little about the Deephaven burying-ground, for its interest was inexhaustible, and I do not know how much time we may have spent in reading the long epitaphs on the gravestones, and trying to puzzle out the inscriptions, which were often so old and worn that we could only trace a letter here and there. It was a neglected corner of the world, and there were straggling sumacs and acacias scattered about the enclosure, while a row of fine old elms marked the boundary of two sides. The grass was long and tangled, and most of the stones leaned one way or the other, and some had fallen flat. There were a few handsome old family monuments clustered in one corner, among which the one that marked Miss Brandon's grave looked so new and fresh that it seemed inappropriate. "It should have been dingy to begin with, like the rest," said Kate one day, "but I think it will make itself look like its neighbors as soon as possible." There were many stones which were sacred to the memory of men who had been lost at sea, almost always giving the name of the departed ship, which was so kept in remembrance, and one felt as much interest in the ship Starlight, supposed to have foundered off the Cape of Good Hope, as in the poor fellow who had the ill luck to be one of her crew. There were dozens of such inscriptions, and there were other stones perpetuating the fame of honorable gentlemen who had been members of Her Majesty's Council, or surveyors of His Majesty's woods, or king's officers of customs for the town of Deephaven. Some of the epitaphs were beautiful, showing that tenderness for the friends who had died, that longing to do them justice, to fully acknowledge their virtues and dearness, which is so touching and so unmistakable, even under the stiff, quaint expressions and formal words which were thought suitable to be chiselled on the stones, so soon to be looked at carelessly by the tearless eyes of strangers. We often used to notice names, and learn their history from the old people whom we knew, and in this way we heard many stories which we never shall forget. It is wonderful, the romance and tragedy and adventure which one may find in a quiet old-fashioned country town, though to heartily enjoy the everyday life One must care to study life and character, and must find pleasure in thought and observation of simple things, and have an instinctive, delicious interest in what to others is unflavored dullness. To go back to Mrs. Patton. On our way home, after our first call upon her, we stopped to speak to Mrs. Dockum, who mentioned that she had seen us going in to the Widow Jim's. "Willin' woman," said Mrs. Dockum, "always been respected, got an uncommon faculty o' speech. I never saw such a hand to talk, but then she has something to say, which ain't the case with everybody. Good neighbor, does according to her means always. Dreadful tough time of it with her husband, shiftless and drunk all his time. Noticed that dent in the side of her forehead, I suppose? That's where he liked to have killed her, slung a stone bottle at her." "What?" said Kate and I, very much shocked. "She don't like to have it inquired about, but she and I were sitting up with man to dame her one night, and she gave me the particulars. I knew he did it, for she was a fit of sickness afterward. Had sliced cucumbers for breakfast that morning. He was very partial to them, and he wanted some vinegar. Happened to be 2 bottles in the cellarway, were just alike, and one of 'em was vinegar and the other had spirit in it at haying time. He takes up the wrong one and pours on quick, and out come the hayseed and flies, and he give the bottle a sling, and it hit her there where you see the scar. Might put the end of your finger into the dent. She said he meant to break the bottle agin the door, but it went slantwise, sort of. I don't know, I'm sure," meditatively. "She said he was good-natured. It was early in the morning, and he hadn't had time to get upset. But he had a high temper naturally, and so much drink hadn't made it much better. She had good prospects when she married him. 6'2", and red cheeks and straight as a Norway pine. Had a good property from his father, and his mother come of a good family, but he died in debt, drank like a fish. Yes, 'twas a shame. Nice woman, good consistent church member, always been respected, useful among the sick." End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush in Marquette, Michigan, July 2008. Deephaven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 4. Deephaven Society. It was curious to notice, in this quaint little fishing village by the sea, how clearly the gradations of society were defined. The place prided itself most upon having been long ago the residence of one Governor Chantry, who was a rich shipowner and East India merchant, and whose fame and magnificence were almost fabulous. It was a never-ceasing regret that the house should have burned down after he died, and there is no doubt that if it were still standing it would rival any ruin of the old world. The elderly people, though laying claim to no slight degree of present consequence, modestly ignored it, and spoke with pride of the grand way in which life was carried on by their ancestors, the Deephaven families of old times. I think Kate and I were assured at least 100 times that Governor Chantry kept a valet, and his wife, Lady Chantry, kept a maid, and that the governor had an uncle in England who was a baronet. And I believe this must have been why our friends felt so deep an interest in the affairs of the English nobility. They no doubt felt themselves entitled to seats near the throne itself. There were formerly 5 families who kept their coaches in Deephaven. There were balls at the governor's, and regal entertainments at other of the grand mansions. There is not a really distinguished person in the country who will not prove to have been directly or indirectly connected with Deephaven. We were shown the cellar of the Chantry house, and the terraces, and a few clumps of lilacs, and the grand rows of elms. There are still 2 of the governor's warehouses left, but his ruined wharves are fast disappearing, and are almost deserted, except by small barefooted boys who sit on the edges to fish for sea perch when the tide comes in. There is an imposing monument in the burying ground to the great man and his amiable consort. I am sure that if there were any surviving relatives of the governor, they would receive in Deephaven far more deference than is consistent with the principles of a republican government. But the family became extinct long since, and I have heard, though it is not a subject that one may speak of lightly, that the sons were unworthy their noble descent and came to inglorious ends. There were still remaining a few representatives of the old families, who were treated with much reverence by the rest of the townspeople, although they were, like the conies of Scripture, a feeble folk. Deephaven is utterly out of fashion. It never recovered from the effects of the embargo of 1807, and a sandbar has been steadily filling in the mouth of the harbor. Though the fishing gives what occupation there is for the inhabitants of the place, it is by no means sufficient to draw recruits from abroad. But nobody in Deephaven cares for excitement, and if someone once in a while has the low taste to prefer a more active life, he is obliged to go elsewhere in search of it, and is spoken of afterward with kind pity. I well remember the widow Moses said to me, in speaking of a certain misguided nephew of hers, "I never could see what could 'a' sought him out to leave so many privileges and go way off to Lynn, with all them children, too. Why, they lived here no more than a cable length from the meeting-house." There were 2 schooners owned in town, and Baja Molly and Joe Sands owned a trawl. There were some schooners and a small brig slowly going to pieces by the wharves, and indeed all Deephaven looked more or less out of repair. All along shore one might see dories and wherries and whale-boats, which had been left to die a lingering death. There is something piteous to me in the sight of an old boat. If one I had used much and cared for were past its usefulness, I should say good-bye to it, and have it towed out to sea and sunk. It never should be left to fall to pieces above high water mark. Even the commonest fishermen felt a satisfaction, and seemed to realize their privilege in being residents of Deephaven. But among the nobility and gentry there lingered a fierce pride in their family and town records, a hardly concealed contempt and pity for people who were obliged to live in other parts of the world. There were acknowledged to be a few disadvantages, such as living nearly a dozen miles from the railway, but, as Miss Honora Carew said, the tone of Deephaven society has always been very high, and it was very nice that there had never been any manufacturing element introduced. She could not feel too grateful, herself, that there was no disagreeable foreign population. "But," said Kate one day, "wouldn't you like to have some pleasant new people brought into town?" "Certainly, my dear," said Miss Honora, rather doubtfully. "I have always been public-spirited, but then we always have guests in summer, and I'm growing old. I should not care to enlarge my acquaintance to any great extent." Miss Honora and Mrs. Dent had lived gay lives in their younger days, and were interested and connected with the outside world more than any of our Deephaven friends, but they were quite contented to stay in their own house, with their books and letters and knitting, and they carefully read Little, and "the new magazine," as they called the Atlantic. The Carews were very intimate with the minister and his sister, and there were 1 or 2 others who belonged to this set. There was Mr. Joshua Dorsey, who wore his hair in a queue, was very deaf, and carried a ponderous cane which had belonged to his venerated father, a much taller man than he. He was polite to Kate and me, but we never knew him much. He went to play whist with the Carews every Monday evening, and commonly went out fishing once a week. He had begun the practice of law, but he had lost his hearing, and at the same time his lady love had inconsiderately fallen in love with somebody else, after which he retired from active business life. He had a fine library, which he invited us to examine. He had many new books, but they looked shockingly overdressed in their fresher bindings, beside the old brown volumes of essays and sermons, and lighter works in many-volume editions. A prominent link in society was Widow Tully, who had been the much-respected housekeeper of old Captain Manning for 40 years. When he died he left her the use of his house and family pew, besides an annuity. The existence of Mr. Tully seemed to be a myth. During the first of his widow's residence in town she had been much affected when obliged to speak of him, and always represented herself as having seen better days, and as being highly connected. But she was apt to be ungrammatical when excited, and there was a whispered tradition that she used to keep a toll bridge in a town in Connecticut, though the mystery of her previous state of existence will probably never be solved. She wore mourning for the captain, which would have befitted his widow, and patronized the townspeople conspicuously, while she herself was treated with much condescension by the Carews and Lorimers. She occupied, on the whole, much the same position that Mrs. Betty Barker did in Cranford, and indeed Kate and I were often reminded of that estimable town. We heard that Kate's aunt, Miss Brandon, had never been appreciative of Mrs. Tully's merits, and that since her death the others had received Mrs. Tully into their society rather more. It seemed as if all the clocks in Deephaven, and all the people with them, had stopped years ago, and the people had been doing over and over what they had been busy about during the last week of their unambitious progress. Their clothes had lasted wonderfully well, and they had no need to earn money when there was so little chance to spend it. Indeed, there were several families who seemed to have no more visible means of support than a balloon. There were no young people whom we knew, though a number used to come to church on Sunday from the inland farms, or the country, as we learned to say. There were children among the fishermen's families at the shore, but a few years will see Deephaven possessed by 2 classes instead of the time-honored 3. As for our first Sunday at church, it must be in vain to ask you to imagine our delight when we heard the tuning of a bass viol in the gallery just before service. We pressed each other's hands most tenderly, looked up at the singers' seats, and then trusted ourselves to look at each other. It was more than we had hoped for. There were also a violin and sometimes a flute, and a choir of men and women singers, though the congregation were expected to join in the psalm singing. The first hymn was, "The Lord our God is full of might, the winds obey his will," to the tune of St. Anne's. It was all so delightfully old-fashioned. Our pew was a square pew, and was by an open window looking seaward. We also had a view of the entire congregation, and as we were somewhat early, we watched the people come in with great interest. The Deephaven aristocracy came with stately step up the aisle. This was all the chance there was for displaying their unquestioned dignity in public. Many of the people drove to church in wagons that were low and old and creaky, with worn buffalo robes over the seat, and some hay tucked underneath for the sleepy, undecided old horse. Some of the younger farmers and their wives had high, shiny wagons with tall horsewhips, which they sometimes brought into church, and they drove up to the steps with a consciousness of being conspicuous and enviable. They had a bashful look when they came in, and for a few minutes after they took their seats they evidently felt that all eyes were fixed upon them, but after a little while they were quite at their ease, and looked critically at the new arrivals. The old folks interested us most. "Do you notice how many more old women there are than old men?" whispered Kate to me, and we wondered if the husbands and brothers had been drowned, and if it must not be sad to look at the blue, sunshiny sea beyond the marshes, if the far-away white sails reminded them of some ships that had never sailed home into Deephaven harbor, or of fishing boats that had never come back to land. The girls and young men adorned themselves in what they believed to be the latest fashion, but the elderly women were usually relics of old times in manner and dress. They wore to church thin, soft silk gowns that must have been brought over from the seas years upon years before, the wide collars fastened with mourning pins holding a lock of hair. They had big black bonnets, some of them with stiff capes, such as Kate and I had not seen before since our childhood. They treasured large rusty lace veils of scraggly pattern, and wore sometimes, on pleasant Sundays, white china crape shawls with attenuated fringes, and there were 2 or 3 of these shawls in the congregation which had been dyed black, and gave an aspect of meekness and general unworthiness to the aged wearer. They clung and drooped about the figure in such a hopeless way. We used to notice often the most interesting scarves, without which no Deephaven woman considered herself in full dress. Sometimes there were red India scarves in spite of its being hot weather, but our favorite ones were long stripes of silk, embroidered along the edges and at the ends with dismal colored floss in old patterns. I think there must have been a fashion once in Deephaven of working these scarves, and I should not be surprised to find that it was many years before the fashion of working samplers came about. Our friends always wore black mitts on warm Sundays, and many of them carried neat little bags of various designs on their arms, containing a precisely folded pocket handkerchief and a frugal lunch of caraway seeds or red and white peppermints. I should like you to see with your own eyes Widow Ware and Miss Experience Hall, two old sisters whose personal appearance we delighted in, and whom we saw feebly approaching down the street this first Sunday morning under the shadow of the two last members of an otherwise extinct race of parasols. There were 2 or 3 old men who sat near us. They were sailors. There is something unmistakable about a sailor, and they had a curiously ancient, uncanny look, as if they might have belonged to the crew of the Mayflower, or even have cruised about with the Northmen in the times of Harold Harfager and his comrades. They had been blown about by so many winter winds, so browned by summer suns and wet by salt spray, that their hands and faces looked like leather, with a few deep folds instead of wrinkles. They had pale blue eyes, very keen and quick. Their hair looked like the fine seaweed which clings to the kelp roots and mussel shells in little locks. These friends of ours sat solemnly at the heads of their pews, and looked unflinchingly at the minister when they were not dozing, and they sang with voices like the howl of the wind, with an occasional deep note or two. Have you never seen faces that seemed old-fashioned? Many of the people in Deephaven Church looked as if they must be, if not supernaturally old, exact copies of their remote ancestors. I wonder if it is not possible that the features and expressions may be almost perfectly reproduced. These faces were not modern American faces, but belonged rather to the days of the early settlement of the country, the old colonial times. We often heard quaint words and expressions which we never had known anywhere else but in old books. There was a great deal of sea lingo in use. Indeed, we learned a great deal ourselves, unconsciously, and used it afterward to the great amusement of our friends. But there were also many peculiar provincialisms, and among the people who lived on the lonely farms inland we often noticed words we had seen in Chaucer and studied out at school in our English literature class. Everything in Deephaven was more or less influenced by the sea. The minister spoke oftenest of Peter and his fishermen companions, and prayed most earnestly every Sunday morning for those who go down to the sea in ships. He made frequent allusions and drew numberless illustrations of a similar kind for his sermons, and indeed I am in doubt whether, if the Bible had been written wholly in inland countries, it would have been much valued in Deephaven. The singing was very droll, for there was a majority of old voices, which had seen their best days long before, and the bass viol was excessively noticeable, and apt to be a little ahead of the time the singers kept, while the violin lingered after. Somewhere on the other side of the church we heard an acute voice, which rose high above all the rest of the congregation, sharp as a needle, and slightly cracked, with a limitless supply of breath. It rose and fell gallantly, and clung long to the high notes of Dundee. It was like the wail of the banshee, which sounds clear to the fated hearer above all other noises. We afterward became acquainted with the owner of this voice, and were surprised to find her a meek widow, who was like a thin black beetle in her pathetic cypress veil and big black bonnet. She looked as if she had forgotten who she was, and spoke with an apologetic whine. But we heard she had a temper as high as her voice, and as much to be dreaded as the equinoctial gale. Near the church was the parsonage, where Mr. Lorimer lived, and the old Lorimer house not far behind was occupied by Miss Rebecca Lorimer. Some stranger might ask the question why the minister and his sister did not live together, but you would have understood it at once after you had lived for a little while in town. They were very fond of each other, and the minister dined with Miss Rebecca on Sundays, and she passed the day with him on Wednesdays, and they ruled their separate households with decision and dignity. I think Mr. Lorimer's house showed no signs of being without a mistress, any more than his sisters betrayed the want of a master's care and authority. The Carews were very kind friends of ours, and had been Miss Brandon's best friends. We heard that there had always been a coolness between Miss Brandon and Miss Lorimer, and that, though they exchanged visits and were always polite, there was a chill in the politeness, and one would never have suspected them of admiring each other at all. We had the whole history of the trouble, which dated back scores of years, from Miss Honora Carew, but we always took pains to appear ignorant of the feud, and I think Miss Lorimer was satisfied that it was best not to refer to it, and to let bygones be bygones. It would not have been true Deephaven courtesy to prejudice Kate against her grand aunt, and Miss Rebecca cherished her dislike in silence, which gave us a most grand respect for her, since we knew she thought herself in the right, though I think it never had come to an open quarrel between these majestic aristocrats. Miss Honora Carew and Mr. Dick, and their elder sister Mrs. Dent, had a charmingly sedate and quiet home in the old Carew house. Mrs. Dent was ill a great deal while we were there, but she must have been a very brilliant woman, and was not at all dull when we knew her. She had outlived her husband and her children, and she had, several years before our summer there, given up her own home, which was in the city, and had come back to Deephaven. Miss Honora, dear Miss Honora, had been one of the brightest, happiest girls, and had lost none of her brightness and happiness by growing old. She had lost none of her fondness for society, though she was so contented in quiet Deephaven, and I think she enjoyed Kate's and my stories of our pleasures as much as we did hers of old times. We used to go to see her almost every day. Mr. Dick, as they called their brother, had once been a merchant in the East Indies, and there were quantities of curiosities and most beautiful china which he had brought and sent home, which gave the house a character of its own. He had been very rich and had lost some of his money, and then he came home and was still considered to possess princely wealth by his neighbors. He had a great fondness for reading and study, which had not been lost sight of during his business life, and he spent most of his time in his library. He and Mr. Lorimer had their differences of opinion about certain points of theology, and this made them much fonder of each other's society, and gave them a great deal of pleasure, for after every series of arguments each was sure that he had vanquished the other, or there were alternate victories and defeats which made life vastly interesting and important. Miss Carew and Mrs. Dent had a great treasury of old brocades and laces and ornaments, which they showed us one day, and told us stories of the wearers, or, if they were their own, there were always some reminiscences which they liked to talk over with each other and with us. I never shall forget the first evening we took tea with them. It impressed us very much, and yet nothing wonderful happened. Tea was handed round by an old-fashioned maid, and afterward we sat talking in the twilight, looking out at the garden. It was such a delight to have tea served in this way. I wonder that the fashion has been almost forgotten. Kate and I took much pleasure in choosing our teapoys. Hers had a mandarin parading on the top, and mine a flight of birds in a pagoda, and we often used them afterward, for Miss Honora asked us to come to tea whenever we liked. A stupid, common country town, some one dared to call Deephaven in a letter once, and how bitterly we resented it. That was a house where we might find the best society, and the most charming manners and good breeding, and if I were asked to tell you what I mean by the word lady, I should ask you to go, if it were possible, to call upon Miss Honora Carew. After a while the elder sister said, "My dears, we always have prayers at 9, for I have to go upstairs early nowadays." And then the servants came in, and we read solemnly the King of Glory psalm, which I have always liked best, and then Mr. Dick read the church prayers, the form of prayer to be used in families. We stayed later to talk with Miss Honora after we had said good night to Mrs. Dent, and we told each other as we went home in the moonlight down the quiet street how much we had enjoyed the evening, for somehow the house and the people had nothing to do with the present or the hurry of modern life. I have never heard that psalm since without its bringing back that summer night in Deephaven, the beautiful quaint old room, and Kate and I feeling so young and worldly by contrast, the flickering, shaded light of the candles, the old book, and the voices that said Amen. There were several other fine old houses in Deephaven beside this and the Brandon house, though that was rather the most imposing. There were 2 or 3 which had not been kept in repair, and were deserted, and of course they were said to be haunted, and we were told of their ghosts, and why they walked, and when. From some of the local superstitions Kate and I have vainly endeavored ever since to shake ourselves free. There was a most heathenish fear of doing certain things on Friday, and there were countless signs in which we still have confidence. When the moon is very bright, and other people grow sentimental, we only remember that it is a fine night to catch hake. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush in Marquette, Michigan, July 2008. Deephaven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 5. The Captains. I should consider my account of Deephaven society incomplete if I did not tell you something of the ancient mariners who may be found every pleasant morning sunning themselves like turtles on one of the wharves. Sometimes there was a considerable group of them, but the less constant members of the club were older than the rest, and the epidemics of rheumatism in town were sadly frequent. We found that it was etiquette to call them each captain, but I think some of the Deephaven men took the title by brevet upon arriving at a proper age. They sat close together because so many of them were deaf, and when we were lucky enough to overhear the conversation it seemed to concern their adventures at sea, or the freight carried out by the Sea Duck, the Ocean Rover, or some other Deephaven ship. The particulars of the voyage and its disasters and successes being as familiar as the wanderings of the children of Israel to an old parson. There were sometimes violent altercations when the captains differed as to the tonnage of some craft that had been a prey to the winds and waves, dry rot, or barnacles 50 years ago. The old fellows puffed away at little black pipes with short stems, and otherwise consumed tobacco in fabulous quantities. It is needless to say that they gave an immense deal of attention to the weather. We used to wish we could join this agreeable company, but we found that the appearance of an outsider caused a disapproving silence, and that the meeting was evidently not to be interfered with. Once we were impertinent enough to hide ourselves for a while just round the corner of the warehouse, but we were afraid or ashamed to try it again, though the conversation was inconceivably edifying. Captain Isaac Horn, the eldest and wisest of all, was discoursing upon some cloth he had purchased once in Bristol, which the shopkeeper delayed sending until just as they were ready to weigh anchor. "I happened to take a look at that cloth," said the captain in a loud, droning voice, "and as quick as I got sight of it, I spoke unpleasant of that swindling English fellow and the crew. They stood back. I was dreadful high-tempered in them days, mind ye, and I had the gig manned. We was out in the stream just ready to sail. 'Twas no use waiting any longer for the wind to change, and we was going north about. I went ashore, and when I walks into his shop you never see a creature so wilted. You see, the miserable sculpin thought I'd never stop to open the goods, and it was a chance I did, mind ye. 'Lor,' says he, grinning and turning the color of a biled lobster, 'I s'posed ye were a standing out to sea by this time.' 'No,' says I, 'and I've got my men out here on the quay, a landing that cloth o' yourn, and if you don't send just what I bought and paid for down there to go back in the gig within 15 minutes, I'll take ye by the collar and drop ye into the dock.' I was twice the size of him, mind ye, and master strong. 'Don't ye like it?' says he, edging round. 'I'll change it for ye then.' Terrible polite he was. 'Like it?' says I. 'It looks as if it were built of dog's hair and divil's wool, kicked together by spiders, and it's coarser than Irish frieze. 3 threads to an armful,' says I." This was evidently one of the captain's favorite stories, for we heard an approving grumble from the audience. In the course of a walk inland we made a new acquaintance, Captain Lant, whom we had noticed at church, and who sometimes joined the company on the wharf. We had been walking through the woods, and coming out to his fields we went on to the house for some water. There was no one at home but the captain, who told us cheerfully that he should be pleased to serve us, though his women folks had gone off to a funeral the other side of the p'int. He brought out a pitcherful of milk, and after we had drunk some, we all sat down together in the shade. The captain brought an old flag-bottomed chair from the wood-house, and sat down facing Kate and me, with an air of certainty that he was going to hear something new and make some desirable new acquaintances, and also that he could tell something it would be worth our while to hear. He looked more and more like a well-to-do old English sparrow, and chippered faster and faster. "Queer ye should know I'm a sailor so quick. Why, I've been a farming it this 20 years. Have to go down to the shore and take a day's fishing every hand's turn, though, to keep the old hulk clear of barnacles. There, I do wish I lived nigher the shore, where I could see the folks I know, and talk about what's been a-going on. You don't know anything about it, you don't, but it's trying to a man to be called old Cap'n Lant, and, so to speak, be forgot when there's anything stirring, and be called grand'ther by clumsy creatures going on 50 and 60, who can't do no more work to-day than I can. And then the women folks keeps a-telling me to be cheerful and not fall, and as how I'm too old to go out fishing, and when they want to be soft-spoken, they say as how they don't see as I fail, and how wonderful I keep my hearing. I never did want to farm it, but she always took it to heart when I was off on the voyage, and this farm and some considerable means beside came to her from her brother, and they all sought to and gave me no peace of mind till I sold out my share of the Ann Eliza and come ashore for good. I did keep an eighth of the Pactolus, and I was ship's husband for a long spell, but she never was heard from on her last voyage to Singapore. I was the lonesomest man when I first come ashore that ever you see. Well, you are master hands to walk, if you come way up from the Brandon house. I wish the women was at home. No, Miss Brandon? Why, yes, and I remember all her brothers and sisters, and her father and mother. I can see 'em now coming into meeting, proud as Lucifer and straight as a mast, every one of 'em. Miss Katharine, she always had her butter from this very farm. Some of the folks used to go down every Saturday, and my wife, she's been in the house 100 times, I s'pose. So you're Hathaway Brandon's granddaughter?" to Kate. "Why, he and I have been out fishing together many's the time. He and Chantry, his next younger brother. Henry, he was a disappointment. He went to furrin parts, and turned out a Catholic priest. I suppose you've heard. I never was so set agin Mr. Henry as some folks was. He was the pleasantest spoken of the whole on 'em. You do look like the Brandons. You really favor 'em considerable. Well, I'm pleased to see you, I'm sure." We asked him many questions about the old people, and found he knew all the family histories, and told them with great satisfaction. We found he had his pet stories, and it must have been gratifying to have an entirely new and fresh audience. He was adroit in leading the conversation around to a point where the stories would come in appropriately, and we helped him as much as possible. In a small neighborhood all the people knew each other's stories and experiences by heart, and I have no doubt the old captain had been snubbed many times on beginning a favorite anecdote. There was a story which he told us that first day, which he assured us was strictly true, and it is certainly a remarkable instance of the influence of one mind upon another at a distance. It seems to me worth preserving at any rate, and as we heard it from the old man, with a solemn voice and serious expression and quaint gestures, it was singularly impressive. "When I was a youngster," said Captain Lant, "I was an orphan, and I was bound out to old Mr. Pelita Dawes' folks, over on the Ridge Road. It was in the time of the last war, and he had a nephew, Ben Dighton, a dreadful high-strung, wild fellow, who had gone off on a privateer. The old man, he set everything by Ben. He would disoblige his own boys any day to please him. This was in his latter days, and he used to have spells of wandering and being out of his head. And he used to call for Ben and talk sort of foolish about him, till they would tell him to stop. Ben never did a stroke of work for him either, but he was a handsome fellow, and had a way with him when he was good-natured. One night old Pelita had been very bad all day and was getting quieted down, and it was after supper. We sat round in the kitchen, and he lay in the bedroom opening out. There were some pitch knots blazing, and the light shone in on the bed, and all of a sudden something made me look up and look in, and there was the old man setting up straight, with his eyes shining at me like a cat's. 'Stop 'em!' he says, 'stop 'em!' And his two sons run in then to catch hold of him, for they thought he was beginning with one of his wild spells, but he fell back on the bed and began to cry like a baby. 'Oh, dear me,' says he, 'they've hung him right up to the yardarm. Oh, they oughtn't to have done it, cut him down quick. He didn't think. He means well, Ben does. He was hasty. Oh, my God, I can't bear to see him swing round by the neck. It's poor Ben hung up to the yardarm. Let me alone, I say.' Andrew and Moses, they were holding him with all their might, and they were both hardy men, but he most got away from them once or twice, and he screeched and howled like a mad creature, and then he would cry again like a child. He was worn out after a while, and lay back quiet, and said over and over, 'Poor Ben,' and 'hung at the yardarm,' and he told the neighbors next day, but nobody noticed him much, and he seemed to forget it as his mind came back. All that summer he was miserable, and towards cold weather he failed right along, though he had been a master strong man in his day, and his timbers held together well. Along late in the fall he had taken to his bed, and one day there came to the house a fellow named Sim Decker, a reckless fellow he was, too, who had gone out in the same ship with Ben. He pulled a long face when he came in, and said he had brought bad news. They had been taken prisoner and carried into port and put in jail, and Ben Dighton had got a fever there and died. 'You lie,' says the old man from the bedroom, speaking as loud and fierce as ever you heard. 'They hung him to the yardarm.' 'Don't mind him,' says Andrew. 'He's wandering like, and he had a bad dream along back in the spring. I s'posed he'd forgotten it.' But the Decker fellow, he turned pale, and kept talking crooked while he listened to old Peleta scolding to him. He answered the questions the women folk asked him. They took on a good deal, but pretty soon he got up and winked to me and Andrew, and we went out in the yard. He began to swear, and then says he, 'When did that old man have his dream?' Andrew couldn't remember, but I knew it was the night before he sold the gray colt, and that was the 24th of April. 'Well,' says Sim Decker, 'on the 23rd day of April Ben Dighton was hung to the yardarm, and I see him do it, Lord help him. I didn't mean to tell the women, and I s'posed you'd never know, for I'm all the one of the ship's company you're ever likely to see. He were taken prisoner, and Ben was mad as fire, and they were scared of him and chained him to the deck, and while he was sulking there a little parrot of a midshipman came up and grinned at him, and snapped his fingers in his face, and Ben lifted his hands with the heavy irons and sprung at him like a tiger, and the boy dropped dead as a stone, and they put a bit of a rope round Ben's neck and slung him right up to the yardarm, and there he swung back and forth until as soon as we dared one of us climb up and cut the rope and let him go over the ship's side, and they put us in irons for that, curse 'em. How did that old man in there know? And he bedridden here, nigh upon 3,000 miles off,' says he. But I guess there wasn't any of us could tell him," said Captain Lant in conclusion. "It's something I never could account for, but it's true as truth. I've known more such cases. Some folks laughs at me for believing 'em. The captain's yarns, they calls 'em. But if you'll notice, everybody's got some yarn of that kind they do believe, if they won't believe yours. And there's a good deal happens in the world that's mysterious. Now there was Widder Oliver Pinkham over to the P'int, told me with her own lips that she—" But just here we saw the captain's expression alter suddenly, and looked round to see a wagon coming up the lane. We immediately said we must go home, for it was growing late, but asked permission to come again and hear the Widow Oliver Pinkham's story. We stopped, however, to see the women folks, and afterward became so intimate with them that we were invited to spend the afternoon and take tea, which invitation we accepted with great pride. We went on fishing also, with the captain and Danny, of whom I will tell you presently. I often think of Captain Lant in the winter, for he told Kate once that he felt master old in winter to what he did in summer. He likes reading, fortunately, and we had a letter from him not long ago, acknowledging the receipt of some books of travel by land and water which we had luckily thought to send him. He gave the latitude and longitude of Deephaven at the beginning of his letter, and signed himself, "Respectfully yours with esteem, Jacob Lant, condemned as unseaworthy." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, in Marquette, Michigan, September 2008. Deephaven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 6. Danny. Deephaven seemed more like one of the lazy little English seaside towns than any other. It was not in the least American. There was no excitement about anything. There were no manufactories. Nobody seemed in the least hurry. The only foreigners were a few stranded sailors. I do not know when a house or a new building of any kind had been built. The men were farmers, or went outward in boats, or inward in fish wagons, or sometimes mackerel and halibut fishing in schooners for the city markets. Sometimes a schooner came to one of the wharves to load with hay or firewood. But Deephaven used to be a town of note, rich and busy, as its forsaken warehouses show. We knew almost all the fisher people at the shore, even old Dinnet, who lived an apparently desolate life by himself in a hut, and was reputed to have been a bloodthirsty pirate in his youth. He was consequently feared by all the children, and for misdemeanors in his latter days avoided generally. Kate talked with him a while one day on the shore, and made him come up with her for a bandage for his hand, which she saw he had hurt badly, and the next morning he brought us a new lobster apiece. Fishermen mean that a thing is only not salted when they say it is fresh. We happened to be in the hall and received him ourselves, and gave him a great piece of tobacco, and unintentionally the means of drinking our health. "Bless your pretty hearts," said he. "May ye be happy and live long, and get good husbands, and if they ain't good to you, may they die from you." None of our friends were more interesting than the fishermen. The fish houses, which might be called the business centre of the town, were at a little distance from the old warehouses, farther down the harbor shore, and were ready to fall down in despair. There were some fishermen who lived near by, but most of them were also farmers in a small way, and lived in the village or further inland. From our eastern windows we could see the moorings, and we always liked to watch the boats go out or come straying in, one after the other, ripping and skimming under the square little sails. And we often went down to the fish houses to see what kind of a catch there had been. I should have imagined that the sea would become very commonplace to men whose business was carried on in boats, and who had spent night after night and day after day from their boyhood on the water. But that is a mistake. They have an awe of the sea and of its mysteries, and of what it hides away from us. They are childish in their wonder at any strange creature which they find. If they have not seen the sea serpent, they believe, I am sure, that other people have, and when a great shark or blackfish or swordfish was taken and brought inshore, everybody went to see it, and we talked about it, and how brave its conqueror was, and what a fight there had been, for a long time afterward. I said that we liked to see the boats go out, but I must not give you the impression that we saw them often, for they weighed anchor at an early hour in the morning. I remember once there was a light fog over the sea, lifting fast as the sun was coming up, and the brownish sails disappeared in the mist, while voices could still be heard for some minutes after the men were hidden from sight. This gave one a curious feeling, but afterward, when the sun had risen, everything looked much the same as usual. The fog had gone, and the dories and even the larger boats were distant specks on the sparkling sea. One afternoon we made a new acquaintance in this wise. We went down to the shore to see if we could hire a conveyance to the lighthouse the next morning. We often went out early in one of the fishing boats, and after we had stayed as long as we pleased, Mr. Kew would bring us home. It was quiet enough that day, for not a single boat had come in, and there were no men to be seen along shore. There was a solemn company of lobster coops or cages which had been brought in to be mended. They always amused Kate. She said they seemed to her like droll old women telling each other secrets. These were scattered about in different attitudes and looked more confidential than usual. Just as we were going away, we happened to see a man at work in one of the sheds. He was the fisherman whom we knew least of all, an odd-looking, silent sort of man, more sunburnt and weather-beaten than any of the others. We had learned to know him by the bright red flannel shirt he always wore, and besides he was lame. Some one told us he had had a bad fall once, on board ship. Kate and I had always wished we could find a chance to talk with him. He looked up at us pleasantly, and when we nodded and smiled, he said, "Good day," in a gruff, hearty voice, and went on with his work cleaning mackerel. "Do you mind our watching you?" asked Kate. "No, ma'am," said the fisherman emphatically. So there we stood. Those fish houses were curious places, so different from any other kind of workshop. In this there was a seine, or part of one, festooned among the cross beams overhead, and there were snarled fishing lines, and barrows to carry fish in, like wheelbarrows without wheels. There were the queer round lobster nets and kits of salt mackerel, tubs of bait and piles of clams, and some queer bones and parts of remarkable fish, and lobster claws of surprising size fastened on the walls for ornament. There was a pile of rubbish down at the end. I dare say it was all useful, however. There is such mystery about the business. Kate and I were never tired of hearing of the fish that come at different times of the year and go away again like the birds, or of the actions of the dogfish, which the longshoremen hate so bitterly. And then there are such curious legends and traditions, of which almost all fishermen have a store. "I think mackerel are the prettiest fish that swim," said I presently. "So do I, miss," said the man. "Not to say but I've seen more fancy-looking fish down in southern waters, bright as any flower you ever see, but a mackerel," holding up one admiringly, "why, they're so clean built and trig-looking. Put a cod alongside, and he looks as lumbering as an old-fashioned Dutch brig outside a yacht. Those are good-looking fish, but they ain't made much account of," continued our friend as he pushed aside the mackerel and took another tub. "They're hake, I suppose you know, but I forgot, I can't stop to bother with them now," and he pulled forward a barrow full of small fish, flat and hard, with pointed bony heads. "Those are porgies, aren't they?" asked Kate. "Yes," said the man, "and I'm going to sliver them for the trawls." We knew what the trawls were, and supposed that the porgies were to be used for bait, and we soon found out what slivering meant by seeing him take them by the head and cut a slice from first one side and then the other, in such a way that the pieces looked not unlike smaller fish. "It seems to me," said I, "that fishermen always have sharper knives than other people." "Yes, we do like a sharp knife in our trade, and then we are mostly strong-handed." He was throwing the porgies' heads and backbones, all that was left of them after slivering, in a heap, and now several cats walked in as if they felt at home, and began a hearty lunch. "What a troop of pussies there is round here!" said I. "I wonder what will become of them in the winter, though to be sure the fishing goes on just the same." "The better part of them don't get through the cold winter," said Danny. "2 or 3 of the old ones have been here for years, and are as much belonging to Deephaven as the meetin' house. But the rest of them ain't to be depended on. You'll miss the young ones by the dozen come spring. I don't know myself but they move inland in the fall of the year. They're knowing enough, if that's all." Kate and I stood in the wide doorway arm in arm, looking sometimes at the queer fishermen and the porgies, and sometimes out to sea. It was low tide, the wind had risen a little, and the heavy salt air blew toward us from the wet brown ledges in the rocky harbor. The sea was bright blue and the sun was shining. 2 gulls were swinging lazily to and fro. There was a flock of sandpipers down by the water's edge in a great hurry as usual. Presently the fisherman spoke again, beginning with an odd laugh. "I was scared last winter.
Jack Scudder and me, we were up in the Cap'n Manning's storehouse, hunting for a half-barrel of salt the skipper said was there. It was an awful blustering kind of day, with a thin icy rain blowing from all points at once. Sea roaring as if it wished it could come ashore and put a stop to everything. Bad days at sea, them are, rigging all froze up. As I was saying, we were hunting for a half-barrel of salt, and I laid hold of a barrel that had something heavy in the bottom and tilted it up, and my eye, there was a stir and a scratch and a squeal, and out went some kind of a creature, and I jumped back, not looking for anything live, but I see in a minute it was a cat, and perhaps you think it is a big story, but there were 8 more in there, hived in together to keep warm. I carved 'em up some new fish that night. They seemed short of provisions. We hadn't been out fishing as much as common, and they hadn't dared to be round the fish house as much, for a fellow who came in on a coaster had a dog, and he used to chase 'em. Hard chance they had, and lots of 'em died, I guess. But there seemed to be some surviving relatives, and always just so hungry. I used to feed them some when I was ashore. I think likely you've heard that a cat will fetch you bad luck, but I don't know's that made much difference to me. I kind of like to keep on the right side of 'em, too. If ever I have a bad dream, there's sure to be a cat in it. But I was brought up to be clever to dumb beasts, and I guess it's my nature. Except fish," said Danny after a minute's thought. "But then it never seems like they had feelin's like creatures that live ashore." And we all laughed heartily, and felt well acquainted. "I suppose you missus will laugh if I tell you I kept a kitty once myself." This was said rather shyly, and there was evidently a story, so we were much interested, and Kate said, "Please tell us about it. Was it at sea?" "Yes, it was at sea, leastways on a coaster. I got her in a singular kind of way. It was one afternoon we were lying alongside Charleston Bridge, and I heard a young cat screeching real pitiful, and after I looked all round, I see her in the water clutching on to the pier of the bridge, and some little divils of boys were heaving rocks down at her. I got into the schooner's tag boat quick, I tell ye, and pushed off for her, and she let go just as I got there, and I guess you never saw a more miserable looking creature than I fished out of the water. Cold weather it was, her leg was hurt and her eye, and I thought first I'd drop her overboard again, and then I didn't, and I took her aboard the schooner and put her by the stove. I thought she might as well die where it was warm. She eat a little mite of chowder before night, but she was very slim. But next morning, when I went to see if she was dead, she fell to licking my finger, and she did purr away like a dolphin. One of her eyes was out, where a stone had took her, and she never got any use of it, but she used to look at you so clever with the other, and she got well of her lame foot after a while. I got to be terrible fond of her. She was just the knowingest thing you ever saw, and she used to sleep alongside of me in my bunk, and like as not she would go on deck with me when it was my watch. I was coasting then for a year and 8 months, and I kept her all the time. We used to be in harbor consider'ble, and about 8 o'clock in the afternoon I used to drop a line and catch her a couple of cunners. Now it is curious that she used to know when I was fishing for her. She would pounce on them fish and carry them off and growl, and she knew when I got a bite. She'd watch the line, but when we were mackereling she never gave us any trouble. She would never lift a paw to touch any of our fish. She didn't have the thieving ways common to most cats. She used to set round on deck in fair weather, and when the wind blew she always kept herself below. Sometimes, when we were in port, she would go ashore a while and fetch back a bird or a mouse, but she wouldn't eat it till she come and showed it to me. She never wanted to stop long ashore, though I never shut her up. I always give her her liberty. I got a good deal of joking about her from the fellows, but she was a sight of company. I don't know as I ever had anything like me as much as she did. Not to say as I ever had much of any trouble with anybody, ashore or afloat. I'm a still kind of fellow, for all I look so rough. But then I hadn't had a home, what I call a home, since I was going on 9 year old. "How has that happened?" asked Kate. "Well, mother, she died, and I was bound out to a man in the tanning trade, and I hated him, and I hated the trade, and when I was a little bigger I ran away, and I've followed the sea ever since. I wasn't much use to him, I guess; leastwise, he never took the trouble to hunt me up. About the best place I ever was in was a hospital. It was in foreign parts. You see I'm crippled some. I fell from the topsail yard to the deck, and I struck my shoulder, and broke my leg, and banged myself all up. It was a nuns' hospital where they took me. All of the nuns were Catholic, and they wore big white things on their heads. I don't suppose you ever saw any. Have you? Well, now that's queer. When I was first there I was scared of them. They were real ladies, and I wasn't used to being in a house, anyway. One of them, they took care of me most of the time. Why, she would even set up half the night with me, and I couldn't begin to tell you how good-natured she was, and she'd look real sorry, too. I used to be ugly, I ached so, along in the first of my being there, but I spoke of it when I was coming away, and she said it was all right. She used to feed me, that lady did, and there was some days I couldn't lift my head, and she would raise it on her arm. She gave me a little mite of a book when I come away. I'm not much of a hand at reading, but I always kept it on account of her. She was so pleased when I got so's to sit up in a chair and look out of the window. She wasn't much of a hand to talk English. I did feel bad to come away from there. I most wished I could be sick a while longer. I never said much of anything either, and I don't know but she thought it was queer, but I am a dreadful clumsy man to say anything, and I got flustered. I don't know's I mind telling you, I was most a crying. I used to think I'd lay by some money and ship for there and carry her something real pretty, but I don't rank able-bodied seaman like I used, and it's as much as I could do to get a berth on a coaster. I suppose I might go as cook. I like to have died with my hurt at that hospital, but when I was getting well it made me think of when I was a mite of a chap to home before mother died, to be laying there in a clean bed with somebody to do for me. Guess you think I'm a good hand to spin long yarns. Somehow it comes easy to talk to-day." "What became of your cat?" asked Kate, after a pause, during which our friend sliced away at the porgies. "I never rightfully knew. It was in Salem harbor, in a windy night. I was on deck considerable, for the schooner pitched lively, and once or twice she dragged her anchor. I never saw the kitty after she eat her supper. I remember I gave her some milk. I used to buy her a pint once in a while for a treat. I don't know but she might have gone off on a cake of ice, but it did seem as if she had too much sense for that. Most likely she missed her footing and fell overboard in the dark. She was marked real pretty, black and white, and kep' herself just as clean. She knew as well as could be when foul weather was coming. She would bother round and act queer, but when the sun was out she would sit round on deck as pleased as a queen. There! I feel bad sometimes when I think of her, and I never went into Salem since without hoping that I should see her. I don't know but I was a-going to begin my life over again. I'd settle down ashore and have a snug little house and farm it. But I guess I shall do better at fishing. Give me a trig-built topsail schooner painted up nice with a stripe on her and clean sails, and a fresh wind with the sun a-shining, and I feel first rate." "Do you believe that codfish swallow stones before a storm?" asked Kate. I had been thinking about the lonely fisherman in a sentimental way, and so irrelevant a question shocked me. "I saw he felt slightly embarrassed at having talked about his affairs so much," Kate told me afterward, "and I thought we should leave him feeling more at his ease if he talked about fish for a while." And sure enough he did seem relieved, and gave us his opinion about the codfish at once, adding that he never cared much for cod anyway. Folks up country bought 'em a good deal, he heard. Give him a haddock right out of the water for his dinner. "I never can remember," said Kate, "whether it is cod or haddock that have a black stripe along their sides." "Oh, those are haddock," said I. "They say that the devil caught a haddock once and it slipped through his fingers and got scorched, so all the haddock had the same mark afterward." "Well, now, how did you know that old story?" said Danny, laughing heartily. "Ye mustn't believe all the old stories you hear, mind ye." "Oh, no," said we. "Hello! There's John Toggerson's boat close in shore. She sets low in the water, so he's done well. He and Skipper Scudder have been out deep sea fishing since yesterday." Our friend pushed the porgies back into a corner, stuck his knife into a beam, and we hurried down to the shore. Kate and I sat on the pebbles, and he went out to the moorings in a dirty dory to help unload the fish. We afterward saw a great deal of Danny, as all the men called him, but though Kate and I tried our best and used our utmost skill and tact to make him tell us more about himself, he never did. But perhaps there was nothing more to be told. The day we left Deephaven we went down to the shore to say good-by to him and to some other friends, and he said, "Going, are ye? Well, I'm sorry. Ye've treated me first rate, the Lord bless ye," and then was so mortified at the way he had said farewell that he turned and fled round the corner of the fish house. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, in Marquette, Michigan, September 2008. Deephaven, by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 7. Captain Sands. Old Captain Sands was one of the most prominent citizens of Deephaven, and a very good friend of Kate's and mine. We often met him and grew much interested in him before we knew him well. He had a reputation in town for being peculiar and somewhat visionary, but every one seemed to like him, and at last one morning, when we happened to be on our way to the wharves, we stopped at the door of an old warehouse which we had never seen opened before. Captain Sands sat just inside, smoking his pipe, and we said good morning, and asked him if he did not think there was a fog coming in by and by. We had thought a little of going out to the lighthouse. The captain rose slowly and came out so that he could see farther round to the east. "There's some scud coming in already," said he. "None to speak of yet. I don't know's you can see it. Yes, you're right. There's a heavy bank of fog laying off, but it won't be in under 2 or 3 hours yet, unless the wind backs round more and freshens up. Weren't thinking of going out, were ye?"
"A little," said Kate, "but we had nearly given it up. We are getting to be very weather-wise, and we pride ourselves on being quick at seeing fogs." At which the captain smiled and said we were considerable young to know much about weather, but it looked well that we took some interest in it. Some young people were fools about weather, and would just as soon set off to go anywhere right under the edge of a thunder-shower.
"Come in and set down, won't ye?" he added. "It ain't much of a place. I've got a lot of old stuff stowed away here that the women folks don't want up to the house. I'm a great hand for keeping things." And he looked round fondly at the contents of the wide low room. "I come down here once in a while and let in the sun, and sometimes I want to hunt up something or 'nother, kind of stow-away place, you see." And then he laughed apologetically, rubbed his hands together, and looked out to sea again, as if he wished to appear unconcerned. Yet we saw that he wondered if we thought it ridiculous for a man of his age to have treasured up so much trumpery in that cobwebby place. There were some whole oars in the sail of his boat, and 2 or 3 killocks and painters, not to forget a heap of worn-out oars and sails in one corner, and a sailor's hammock slung across the beam overhead. And there were some sailors' chests, and the capstan of a ship, and innumerable boxes which all seemed to be stuffed full, besides no end of things lying on the floor and packed away on shelves and hanging to rusty, big-headed nails in the wall. I saw some great lumps of coral and large rough shells, a great hornet's nest, and a monstrous lobster shell. The captain had cobbled and tied up some remarkable old chairs for the accommodation of himself and his friends. "What a nice place!" said Kate in a frank, delighted way which could not have failed to be gratifying. "Well, no," said the cap'n, with his slow smile. "It ain't what you'd rightly call nice, as I know of. It ain't never been cleared out all at once since I begin putting in. There's nothing that's worth anything either, to anybody but me. Wife, she's said to me 100 times, 'Why don't you overhaul them old things and burn 'em?' She's always at me about letting the property, as if it were a corner lot in Broadway. That's all women folks know about business."
And here the captain caught himself tripping, and looked uneasy for a minute.
"I suppose I might have let it for a fish house, but it's most too far from the shore to be handy, and, well, there are some things here that I set a good deal by."
"Isn't that a swordfish's sword in that piece of wood?" Kate asked presently, and was answered that it was found broken off as we saw it, in the hull of a wreck that went ashore on Blue Point, when the captain was a young man, and he had sawed it out and kept it ever since. 59 years. Of course we went closer to look at it, and we both felt a great sympathy for this friend of ours, because we have the same fashion of keeping worthless treasures, and we understand perfectly how dear such things may be. "Do you mind if we look around a little?" I asked doubtfully, for I knew how I should hate having strangers look over my own treasury, but Captain Sands looked pleased at our interest, and said cheerfully that we might overhaul as much as we chose. Kate discovered first an old battered wooden figure-head of a ship, a woman's head with long curly hair falling over the shoulders. The paint was almost gone, and the dust covered most of what was left. Still there was a wonderful spirit and grace, and a wild, weird beauty which attracted us exceedingly. But the captain could only tell us that it had belonged to the wreck of a Danish brig, which had been driven on the reef where the lighthouse stands now, and his father had found this on the long sands a day or two afterward.
"That was a dreadful storm," said the captain. "I've heard the old folks tell about it. It was when I was only a year or two old. There were 3 merchantmen wrecked within 5 miles of Deephaven. This one was all stove to splinters, and they used to say she had treasures aboard. When I was small I used to have a great idea of going out there to the rocks at low water and trying to find some gold, but I never made out no great." And he smiled indulgently at the thought of his youthful dream.
"Kate," said I, "do you see what beauties these Turk's Head knots are?" We had been taking a course of first lessons in knots from Danny, and had followed by learning some charmingly intricate ones from Captain Lant, the stranded mariner who lived on a farm 2 miles or so inland. Kate came over to look at the Turk's Heads, which were at either end of the rope handles of a little dark blue chest. Captain Sands turned in his chair and nodded approval.
"That's a neat piece of work, and it was a first-rate seaman who did it. He's dead and gone years ago, poor young fellow. An Italian, he was, who sailed on the Ranger 3 or 4 long voyages. He fell from the masthead on the voyage from Callao. Cap'n Manning and old Mr. Lorimer, they owned the Ranger, and when she came into port and they got the news they took it as much to heart as if he'd been some relation. He was smart as a whip, and had a way with him, and the pleasantest kind of a voice. You couldn't help liking him. They found out that he had a mother alive in Port Mahon, and they sent his pay and some money he had in the bank at Riverport out to her by a ship that was going to the Mediterranean. He had some clothes in his chest, and they sold those and sent her the money, all but some trinkets they supposed he was keeping for her. I recollect he used to speak considerable about his mother. I shipped 1 voyage with him before the mast, before I went out mate of the Daylight. I happened to be in port the time the Ranger got in, and I see this chist laying round in Cap'n Manning's storehouse, and I offered to give him what it was worth. But we was good friends, and he told me take it if I wanted it. It was no use to him, and I've kept it ever since. There are some of his traps in it now, I believe. You can look." And we took off some tangled cod lines and opened the chest. There was only a round wooden box in the till,
and in some idle hour at sea the young sailor had carved his initials and an anchor and the date on the cover. We found some sail needles and a palm in his kit, as the sailors call it, and a little string of buttons with some needles and yarn and thread in a neat little bag, which perhaps his mother had made for him when he started off on his little voyage. Besides these things there was only a fanciful little broken buckle, green and gilt, which he might have picked up in some foreign street, and his protection paper, carefully folded, wherein he was certified as being citizen of the United States, with dark complexion and dark hair. "He was one of the pleasantest fellows that ever I shipped with," said the captain, with a gruff tenderness in his voice. "Always willing to do his work himself, and like's not, when the other fellows up on the rigging were cold or ugly about something or 'nother, he'd say something that would set them all laughing, and somehow it made you good-natured to see him round. He was brought up a Catholic, I suppose. Anyway, he had some beads, and sometimes they would joke him about 'em on board ship, but he would blaze up in a minute, ugly as a tiger. I never saw him mad about anything else, though he wouldn't stand it if anybody tried to crowd him. He fell from the main to gallant yard to the deck, and was dead when they picked him up. They were off the Bermudas. I suppose he lost his balance, but I never could see how. He was sure-footed, and as quick as a cat. They said they saw him try to catch at the stay, but there was a heavy sea running, and the ship rolled just so's to let him through between the rigging, and he struck the deck like a stone. I don't know's that chest has been opened these 10 years. I declare it carries me back to look at those poor little traps of his. Well, it's the way of the world. We think we're somebody, and we have our day, but it isn't long afore we're forgotten." The captain reached over for the paper, and taking out a clumsy pair of steel-bowed spectacles, read it through carefully. "I'll warrant he took good care of this," said he. "He was an Italian, and no more of an American citizen than a Chinese. I wonder he hadn't called himself John Jones. That's the name most of the foreigners used to take when they got their papers. I remember once I was sick with a fever in Chelsea Hospital, and one morning they came bringing in the mate of a Portuguese brig on a stretcher, and the surgeon asked what his name was. 'John Jones,' says he. 'Oh, say something else,' says the surgeon. 'We've got 5 John Joneses here already, and it's getting to be no name at all.' Sailors are great hands for false names. They have a trick of using them when they have any money to leave ashore, for fear their shipmates will go and draw it out. I suppose there are thousands of dollars unclaimed in New York banks where men have left it charged to their false names. Then they get lost at sea or something, and never go to get it, and nobody knows whose it is. They're curious folks, take 'em all together, sailors is, 'specially them foreign fellows that wander about from ship to ship. They're getting to be a dreadful low set, too, of late years. It's the last thing I'd want a boy of mine to do, ship before the mast with one of these mixed crews. It's a dog's life anyway, and the risks and the chances against you are awful. It's a good while before you can lay up anything, unless you are part owner. I saw all the points a good deal plainer after I quit following the sea myself, though I've always been more or less into navigation until this last war came on. I know when I was ship's husband of the Polly and Susan, there was a young man went out captain of her last voyage, and she never was heard from. He had a wife and 2 or 3 little children, and for all he was so smart they would have been about the same as beggars if I hadn't happened to have his life insured the day I was having the papers made out for the ship. I happened to think of it. $500 there was, and I sent it to the widow along with his primage. She hadn't expected nothing, or next to nothing, and she was pleased, I tell ye."
"I think it was very kind in you to think of that, Captain Sands," said Kate.
And the old man said, flushing a little, "Well, I'm not so smart as some of the men who started when I did, and some of 'em went ahead of me, and some of 'em didn't, after all. I've tried to be honest, and to do just about as nigh right as I could, and you know there's an old saying,
that a cripple in the right road will beat a racer in the wrong.
End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Deephaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, in Marquette, Michigan, November 2008. Deephaven by Sarah Orne Jewett. Chapter 8. The Circus at Denby. Kate and I looked forward to a certain Saturday with as much eagerness as if we had been little schoolboys, for on that day we were to go to a circus at Denby, a town perhaps 8 miles inland. There had not been a circus so near Deephaven for a long time, and nobody had dared to believe the first rumor of it, until 2 dashing young men had deigned to come themselves to put up the big posters on the end of Bijah Molly's barn. All the boys in town came as soon as possible to see these amazing pictures, and some were wretched in their secret hearts at the thought that they might not see the show itself. Tommy Dockum was more interested than anyone else, and mentioned the subject so frequently one day when he went blackberrying with us that we grew enthusiastic, and told each other what fun it would be to go, for everybody would be there, and it would be the greatest loss to us if we were absent. I thought I had lost my childish fondness for circuses, but it came back redoubled, and Kate may contradict me if she chooses, but I am sure she never looked forward to the Easter oratorio with half the pleasure she did to this caravan, as most of the people called it. We felt that it was a great pity that any of the boys and girls should be left lamenting at home, and finding that there were some of our acquaintances and Tommy's who saw no chance of going, we engaged Joe Sands and Leander Dockum to carry them to Denby in 2 fish wagons with boards laid across for the extra seats. We saw them join the straggling train of carriages which had begun to go through the village from all along shore, soon after daylight, and they started on their journey shouting and carousing, with their pockets crammed with early apples and other provisions. We thought it would have been fun enough to see the people go by, for we had had no idea until then how many inhabitants that country held. We had asked Mrs. Kew to go with us, but she was half an hour later than she had promised, for, since there was no wind, she could not come ashore in the sailboat, and Mr. Kew had had to row her in the dory. We saw the boat at last nearly inshore, and drove down to meet it. Even the horse seemed to realize what a great day it was, and showed a disposition to friskiness, evidently as surprising to himself as to us. Mrs. Kew was funnier that day than we had ever known her, which is saying a great deal, and we should not have had half so good a time if she had not been with us. Although she lived in the lighthouse, she had no chance to "see passing," which a woman prizes so highly in the country. She had a wonderful memory for faces, and could tell us the names of all Deephaveners and of most of the people we met outside its limits. She looked impressed and solemn as she hurried up from the water's edge, giving Mr. Kew some parting charges over her shoulder as he pushed off the boat to go back. But after we had convinced her that the delay had not troubled us, she seemed more cheerful. It was evident that she felt the importance of the occasion, and that she was pleased at our having chosen her for company. She threw back her veil entirely, sat very straight, and took immense pains to bow to every acquaintance whom she met. She wore her best Sunday clothes, and her manner was formal for the first few minutes. It was evident that she felt we were meeting under unusual circumstances, and that, although we had often met before on the friendliest terms, our having asked her to make this excursion in public required a different sort of behavior at her hands, and a due amount of ceremony and propriety. But this state of things did not last long, as she soon made a remark at which Kate and I laughed so heartily in lighthouse acquaintance fashion that she unbent, and gave her whole mind to enjoying herself. When we came by the shore where the post office was kept, We saw a small knot of people gathered round the door, and stopped to see what had happened. There was a forlorn horse standing near, with his harness tied up with fuzzy ends of rope, and the wagon was cobbled together with pieces of board. The whole craft looked as if it might be wrecked with the least jar. In the wagon were 4 or 5 stupid-looking boys and girls. One of them was crying softly. Their father was sick, someone told us. He has took faint, but he is coming to all right. They have given him something to take. Their name is Craper, and they live way over beyond the ridge on Stone Hill. They were going over to Denby to the circus, and the man was calculating to get doctored, but I dunno's he can get so fur. He's powerful slim looking to me. Kate and I went to see if we could be of any use, and when we went into the store we saw the man leaning back in his chair, looking ghastly pale, and as if he were far gone in consumption. Kate spoke to him, and he said he was better. He had felt bad all the way along, but he hadn't given up. He was pitiful, poor fellow, with his evident attempt at dressing up. He had the bushiest, dustiest red hair and whiskers, which made the pallor of his face still more striking, and his illness had thinned and paled his rough, clumsy hands. I thought what a hard piece of work it must have been for him to start for the circus that morning, and how kind-hearted he must be to have made such an effort for his children's pleasure. As we went out, they stared at us gloomily. The shadow of their disappointment touched and chilled our pleasure. Somebody had turned the horse so that he was heading toward home, and by his actions he showed that he was the only one of the party who was glad. We were so sorry for the children. Perhaps it had promised to be the happiest day of their lives, and now they must go back to their uninteresting home without having seen the great show. "I am so sorry you are disappointed," said Kate, as we were wondering how the man who had followed us would ever climb into the wagon. "Eh?" said he, blankly, as if he did not know what her words meant. "What fool has been a-turning o' this horse?" he asked a man who was looking on. "Why, which way be you going?" "To the circus," said Mr. Craper, with decision. "Where do you suppose? That's where I started for, anyways." And he climbed in and glanced round to count the children, struck the horse with the willow switch, and they started off briskly, while everybody laughed. Kate and I joined Mrs. Kew, who had enjoyed the scene. "Well, there," said she, "I wonder the folks in the old North Burying Ground ain't a-rising up to go to Denby to that caravan." We reached Denby at noon. It was an uninteresting town, which had grown up around some mills. There was a great commotion in the streets, and it was evident that we had lost much in not having seen the procession. There was a great deal of business going on in the shops, and there were 2 or 3 hand organs at large, near one of which we stopped a while to listen, just after we had met Leander and given the horse into his charge. Mrs. Kew finished her shopping as soon as possible, and we hurried toward the great tents, where all the flags were flying. I think I have not told you that we were to have the benefit of seeing a menagerie in addition to the circus, and you may be sure we went faithfully round to see everything that the cages held. I cannot truthfully say that it was a good show. It was somewhat dreary, now that I think of it quietly and without excitement. The creatures looked tired, and as if they had been on the road for a great many years. The animals were all old, and there was a shabby great elephant whose look of general discouragement went to my heart, for it seemed as if he were miserably conscious of a misspent life. He stood dejected and motionless at one side of the tent, and it was hard to believe that there was a spark of vitality left in him. A great number of the people had never seen an elephant before, and we heard a thin old man who stood near us say delightedly, "There's the old creature, and no mistake, Ann Liza. I wanted to see him most of anything. My sakes, ain't he big!" And Ann Eliza, who was stout and sleepy-looking, droned out, "Yes, there's considerable of him, but he looks as if he ain't got no animation." Kate and I turned away and laughed, while Mrs. Kew said confidently, as the couple moved away, "She needn't be a reflecting on the poor beast. That's Mis. Seth Tanner. and there isn't a woman in Deephaven nor East Parish to be named the same day with her for laziness. I'm glad she didn't catch sight of me. She'd have talked about nothing for a fortnight." There was a picture of a huge snake in Deephaven, and I was just wondering where he could be, or if there ever had been one, when we heard a boy ask the same question of the man whose thankless task it was to stir up the lions with a stick to make them roar. "The snake's dead," he answered good-naturedly. "Didn't you have to dig an awful long grave for him?" asked the boy. But the man said he reckoned they curled him up some, and smiled as he turned to his lions, who looked as if they needed a tonic. Everybody lingered longest before the monkeys, who seemed to be the only lively creatures in the whole collection, and finally we made our way into the other tent, and perched ourselves on a high seat, from whence we had a capital view of the audience and the ring, and could see the people come in. Mrs. Kew was on the lookout for acquaintances, and her spirits as well as our own seemed to rise higher and higher. She was on the alert, moving her head this way and that to catch sight of people, giving us a running commentary in the meantime. It was very pleasant to see a person so happy as Mrs. Kew was that day, and I dare say in speaking of the occasion she would say the same thing of Kate and me, for it was such a good time. We bought some peanuts, without which no circus seems complete, and we listened to the conversations which were being carried on around us while we were waiting for the performance to begin. There were two old farmers whom we had noticed occasionally in Deephaven. One was telling the other, with great confusion of pronouns, about a big pig which had lately been killed. "John did feel dreadful disappointed at having to kill now," we heard him say, "being as he was calculated to kill along near Thanksgiving time. There was going to be a new moon then, and he expected to get 75 or 100 pound more on to him. But he didn't seem to gain, and me and 'Bijah both told him he'd be better to kill now, while everything was favorable, and if he set out to wait something might happen to him, and then I've always held that you can't get no hog only just so far, and for my part I don't like these great overgrown creatures. I like well enough to see a hog that'll weigh 600 just for the beauty on't, but for my eating give me one that'll just rise 3. 'Bijah's accurate, and he says he is going to weigh rising 550. I shall stop as I go home to John's wife's brothers and see if they've got the particulars yet. John was going to set the scales this morning. I guess likely considerable many'll gather there to morrow after meeting. John didn't calculate to cut up till Monday." "I guess likely I'll stop in to morrow," said the other man. "I like to see a handsome hog. Chester white, you said? Consider them best, don't ye?" But this question never was answered, for the greater part of the circus company in gorgeous trappings came parading in. The circus was like all other circuses, except that it was shabbier than most, and the performers seemed to have less heart in it than usual. They did their best, and went through with their parts conscientiously, but they looked as if they never had had a good time in their lives. The audience was hilarious, and cheered and laughed at the tired clown until he looked as if he thought his speeches might possibly be funny after all. We were so glad we had pleased the poor thing, and when he sang a song our satisfaction was still greater, and so he sang it all over again. Perhaps he had been associating with people who were used to circuses. The afternoon was hot, and the boys, with Japanese fans and trays of lemonade, did a remarkable business for so late in the season. The brass band on the other side of the tent shrieked its very best, and all the young men of the region had brought their girls, and some of these countless pairs of country lovers we watched a great deal, as they kept company with more or less depth of satisfaction in each other. We had a grand chance to see the fashions, and there were many old people and a great number of little children, and some families had evidently locked their house door behind them since they had brought both the dog and the baby. "Doesn't it seem as if you were a child again?" Kate asked me. "I am sure this is just the same as the first circus I ever saw. It grows more and more familiar, and it puzzles me to think they should not have altered in the least while I have changed so much, and have even had time to grow up. You don't know how it is making me remember other things of which I have not thought for years. I was 7 years old when I went that first time, Uncle Jack invited me. I had a new parasol, and he laughed because I would hold it over my shoulder when the sun was in my face. He took me into the side shows, and bought me everything I asked for on the way home, and we did not get home until twilight. The rest of the family had dined at 4 o'clock and gone out for a long drive, and it was such fun to have our dinner by ourselves. I sat at the head of the table in Mamma's place, and when Bridget came down and insisted that I must go to bed, Uncle Jack came softly upstairs and sat by the window smoking and telling me stories. He ran and hid in the closet when he heard Mamma coming up, and when she found him out by the cigar smoke and made believe scold him, I thought she was in earnest, and begged him off. Yes, and I remember that Bridget sat in the next room, making her new dress so she could wear it to church next day. I thought it was a beautiful dress, and besought Mamma to have one like it. It was bright green with yellow spots all over it, said Kate. Ah, poor Uncle Jack! He was so good to me. We were always telling stories of what we would do when I was grown up. He died in Canton the next year, and I cried myself ill, but for a long time I thought he might not be dead after all, and might come home any day. He used to seem so old to me, and he really was just out of college and not so old as I am now. That day at the circus he had a pink rosebud in his buttonhole. And when have I ever thought of this before? A woman sat before us who had a stiff little cape on her bonnet like a shelf, and I carefully put peanuts around the edge of it, and when she moved her head they would fall off. I thought it was the best fun in the world, and I wished Uncle Jack to ride the donkey. I was sure he could keep on, before his horse had capered about with him one day on Beacon Street, and I thought him a perfect rider, since nothing had happened to him then. I remember, said Mrs. Kew presently, that just before I was married he took me to Wareham Corners to a caravan. My sister Hannah and the young man who was keeping company with her went too. I haven't been to one since till to-day, and it does carry me back same's it does you, Miss Kate. It doesn't seem more than 5 years ago, and what would I have thought if I had known he and I were going to keep a lighthouse and be contented there? What's more, and sometimes not get ashore for a fortnight. Settled, gray-headed old folks. We were gay enough in those days. I know old Miss Sabrina Smith warned me that I'd better think twice before I took up with Tom Kew, for he was a light-minded young man. I speak of that to him in the winter-time, when he sets reading the almanac half asleep and I'm knitting, and the wind's a-howling and the waves coming ashore on those rocks as if they wished they could put out the light and blow down the lighthouse. We were reflected on a good deal for going to that caravan. Some of the old folks didn't think it was improving. Well, I should think that man was a-trying to break his neck. Coming out of that great tent was disagreeable enough, and we seemed to have chosen the worst time, for the crowd pushed fiercely, though I suppose nobody was in the least hurry, and we were all severely jammed, while from somewhere underneath came the wails of a deserted dog. We had not meant to see the side-shows, and went carelessly past 2 or 3 tents, but when we came in sight of the picture of the Kentucky giantess, we noticed that Mrs. Kew looked at it wistfully, and we immediately asked if she cared anything about going to see the wonder, whereupon she confessed that she never heard of such a thing as a woman's weighing 650 pounds, so we all 3 went in. There were only 2 or 3 persons inside the tent, besides a little boy who played the hand organ. The Kentucky giantess sat in 2 chairs on a platform, and there was a large cage of monkeys just beyond, toward which Kate and I went at once. "Why, she isn't more than 2/3 as big as the picture," said Mrs. Kew in a regretful whisper, "but I guess she's big enough. Doesn't she look discouraged, poor creature?" Kate and I felt ashamed of ourselves for being there. No matter if she had consented to be carried round for a show, it must have been horrible to be stared at and joked about day after day, and we gravely looked at the monkeys, and in a few minutes turned to see if Mrs. Kew were not ready to come away, when to our surprise we saw that she was talking to the giantess with great interest, and we went nearer. "I thought your face looked natural the minute I set foot inside the door," said Mrs. Kew. But you've altered some since I saw you, and I couldn't place you till I heard you speak. Why, you used to be spare. I'm amazed, Merrily. Where are your folks?"
"I don't wonder you are surprised," said the giantess. "I was a good ways from this when you knew me, wasn't I? But father, he ran through with every cent he had before he died, and he took to drink, and it killed him after a while, and then I began to grow worse and worse, till I couldn't do nothing to earn a dollar, and everybody was a coming to see me, till at last I used to ask 'em 10 cents apiece, and I scratched along somehow till this man came round and heard of me, and he offered me my keep and good pay to go along with him. He had another giantess before me, but she had begun to fall away considerable, so he paid her off and let her go. This other giantess was an awful expense to him, she was such an eater. Now I don't have no great of an appetite," this was said plaintively, "and he's raised my pay since I've been with him because we did so well. I took up with his offer because I was nothing but a drag and never will be. I'm as comfortable as I can be, but it's a pretty hard business. My oldest boy is able to do for himself, but he's married this last year, and his wife don't want me. I don't know's I blame her either. It would be something like if I had a daughter now, but there, I'm getting to like travelling first rate. It gives anybody a good deal to think of."
"I was asking the folks about you when I was up home the early part of the summer," said Mrs. Kew, "but all they knew was that you were living out in New York State. Have you been living in Kentucky long? I saw it on the picture outside."
"No," said the giantess, "that was a picture the man bought cheap from another show that broke up last year. It says 650 pounds, but I don't weigh more than 400. I haven't been weighed for some time past. Between you and me, I don't weigh so much as that, but you mustn't mention it, for it would spoil my reputation, and might hinder my getting another engagement." And then the poor giantess lost her professional look and tone as she said, "I believe I'd rather die than grow any bigger. I do lose heart sometimes, and wish I was a smart woman and could keep house. I'd be smarter than ever I was when I had the chance, I tell you that. Is Tom along with you?"
"No, I came with these young ladies, Miss Lancaster and Miss Dennis, who are stopping over to Deephaven for the summer." Kate and I turned as we heard this introduction. We were standing close by, and I am proud to say that I never saw Kate treat any one more politely than she did that absurd, pitiful creature with the gilt crown and many bracelets. It was not that she said much, but there was such an exquisite courtesy in her manner, and an apparent unconsciousness of there being anything in the least surprising or uncommon about the giantess. Just then a party of people came in, and Mrs. Kew said good-bye reluctantly. "It has done me sights of good to see you," said our new acquaintance. "I was feeling downhearted just before you came in. I'm pleased to see somebody that remembers me as I used to be." And they shook hands in a way that meant a great deal, and when Kate and I said good afternoon, the giantess looked at us gratefully, and said, "I'm very much obliged to you for coming in, young ladies."
Walk in, the man was shouting as we came away. "Walk in and see the wonder of the world, ladies and gentlemen, the largest woman ever seen in America, the great Kentucky giantess."
"Wouldn't you have liked to stay longer?" Kate asked Mrs. Kew as we came down the street. But she answered that it would be no satisfaction. The people were coming in, and she would have no chance to talk. I never knew her very well. She is younger than I, and she used to go to meeting where I did, but she lived 5 or 6 miles from our house. She's had a hard time of it, according to her account," said Mrs. Kew. "She used to be a dreadful flighty, high-tempered girl, but she's lost that now, I can see by her eyes. I was running over in my mind to see if there was anything I could do for her, but I don't know as there is. She said the man who hired her was kind. I guess your treating her so polite did her as much good as anything. She used to be real ambitious. I had it on my tongue's end to ask her if she couldn't get a few days' leave and come out to stop with me, but I thought just in time that she'd sink the dory in a minute. There, seeing her has took away all the fun," said Mrs. Kew ruefully, and we were all dismal for a while, but at last, after we were fairly started for home, we began to be merry again. We passed the Craper family, whom we had seen at the store in the morning. The children looked as stupid as ever, but the father, I am sorry to say, had been tempted to drink more whiskey than was good for him. He had a bright flush on his cheeks, and he was flourishing his whip and hoarsely singing some meaningless tune. "Poor creature," said I should think this day's pleasuring would kill him." "Now wouldn't you think so?" said Mrs. Kew sympathizingly. "But the truth is, you couldn't kill one of those Crapers if you pounded him in a mortar." We had a pleasant drive home, and we kept Mrs. Kew to supper, and afterward went down to the shore to see her set sail for home. Mr. Kew had come in some time before, and had been waiting for the moon to rise. Mrs. Kew told us that she should have enough to think of for a year, she had enjoyed the day so much, and we stood on the pebbles watching the boat out of the harbor, and wishing ourselves on board. It was such a beautiful evening. We went to another show that summer, the memory of which will never fade. It is somewhat impertinent to call it a show, and public entertainment is equally inappropriate, though we certainly were entertained. It had been raining for 2 or 3 days. The Deephavenites spoke of it as a spell of weather. Just after tea one Thursday evening, Kate and I went down to the post office. When we opened the great hall door, the salt air was delicious, but we found the town apparently wet through and discouraged, and though it had almost stopped raining just then, there was a Scotch mist, like a snowstorm with the chill taken off, and the chantry elms dripped hurriedly and creaked occasionally in the east wind. "There will not be a captain in the wharves for a week after this," said I to Kate. "Only think of the cases of rheumatism." We stopped for a few minutes at the Carews, who were as much surprised to see us as if we had been mermaids out of the sea, and begged us to give ourselves something warm to drink, and to change our boots the moment we got home. Then we went on to the post office. Kate went in, but stopped, as she came out with her letters, to read a written notice securely fastened to the grocery door by 4 large carpet tacks with wide leathers round their necks. "Dear," said she exultantly, "there's going to be a lecture to-night in the church, a free lecture on the elements of true manhood. Wouldn't you like to go?" And we went. We were 15 minutes later than the time appointed, and were sorry to find that the audience was almost imperceptible. The dampness had affected the antiquated lamps, so that those on the walls and on the front of the gallery were the dimmest lights I ever saw, and sent their feeble rays through a small space the edges of which were clearly defined. There were 2 rather more energetic lights on the table near the pulpit, where the lecturer sat, and as we were in the rear of the church, we could see the yellow fog between ourselves and him. There were 14 persons in the audience, and we were all huddled together in a cowardly way in the pews nearest the door. 3 old men, 4 women, and 4 children, besides ourselves and the sexton, a deaf little old man with a wooden leg. The children whispered noisily, and soon, to our surprise, the lecturer rose and began. He bowed and treated us with beautiful deference, and read his dreary lecture with enthusiasm. I wish I could say, for his sake, that it was interesting, but I cannot tell a lie, and it was so long. He went on and on until it seemed as if I had been there ever since I was a little girl. Kate and I did not dare to look at each other, and in my desperation at feeling her quiver with laughter, I moved to the other end of the pew, knocking over a big hymn book on the way, which attracted so much attention that I have seldom felt more embarrassed in my life. Kate's great dog rose several times to shake himself and yawn loudly, and then lie down again despairingly. You would have thought the man was addressing an enthusiastic young men's Christian association. He exhorted with fervor upon our duties as citizens and as voters, and told us a great deal about George Washington and Ben Franklin, whom he urged us to choose as our examples. He waited for applause after each of his outbursts of eloquence, and presently went on again, in no wise disconcerted at the silence, and as if he were sure that he would fetch us next time. The rain began to fall again heavily, and the wind wailed around the meeting-house. If the lecture had been upon any other subject, it would not have been so hard for Kate and me to keep sober faces, but it was directed entirely toward young men, and there was not a young man there. The children in front of us mildly scuffled with each other at one time, until the one at the end of the pew dropped a marble, which struck the floor and rolled with a frightful noise down the edge of the aisle, where there was no carpet. The congregation instinctively started up to look after it, but we recollected ourselves, and leaned back again in our places, while the odd children, after keeping unnaturally quiet, fell asleep, and tumbled against each other helplessly. After a time the man sat down and wiped his forehead, looking well satisfied, and when we were wondering whether we might with propriety come away, he rose again and said it was a free lecture, and he thanked us for our kind patronage on that inclement night. But in other places which he had visited there had been a contribution taken up for the cause. It would, perhaps, do no harm with the sexton, but the sexton could not have heard the sound of a cannon at that distance and slumbered on. Neither Kate nor I had any money except a $20 bill in my purse and some coppers in the pocket of her waterproof cloak, which she assured me she was prepared to give. But we gave no signs of the sexton's waking, and so one of the women kindly went forward to wake the children. We all rose and came away. After we had made as much fun and laughed as long as we pleased that night, we became suddenly conscious of the pitiful side of it all, and being anxious that any one should have the highest opinion of Deephaven, we sent Tom Dockham early in the morning with an anonymous note to the lecturer, whom he found without much trouble. But afterward we were disturbed at hearing that he was going to repeat his lecture that evening, the wind having gone round to the northwest, and I have no doubt there were a good many women able to be out, and that he harvested enough 10-cent pieces to pay his expenses without our help, though he had particularly told us it was for the cause the evening before, and that ought to have been a consolation. End of Chapter 8.